Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. Working at a morgue was never part of my life plan. It's not the kind of job you dream about as a kid, but life led me down this path in a way I never quite understood. My name is Alex, and a few years ago I worked as an assistant at a small morgue in Cedar Hill, just outside Portland, Oregon. I wasn't a forensic pathologist or a doctor, just an assistant who did whatever they asked. Moving bodies, preparing reports, cleaning, and occasionally assisting with embalmings. I never imagined that one particular October night would leave me with a question I could never answer. That night I was alone. My supervisor had left early, and the morgue was completely silent. The kind of silence you learn to ignore after working there long enough. It's not ordinary silence, but something dense, heavy, that makes you feel like you're not really alone. I had received the body of a 42-year-old man a few hours earlier. According to the report, his death had been from a massive heart attack. No attempts at resuscitation, no signs of struggle, as if his body had simply stopped functioning. Nothing out of the ordinary. I needed to prepare him for embalming before storing him in the refrigeration chamber. It was a routine procedure, until it stopped being routine. When I uncovered the body to begin the procedure, I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't the cold of the room, but something deeper, more unsettling. The deceased man's face had an expression of serenity, too much serenity. It was as if instead of being dead, he was simply waiting. This wasn't something you saw on every body. Rigor mortis usually distorts facial muscles, but this man had a disturbing peace in his features, almost as if he was still aware of what was happening around him. I told myself it was just my imagination and began to work. I placed the instruments on the table, prepared the chemicals, and adjusted the drainage hose. But as I progressed, something didn't feel right. At one point, I looked away from the body to write in the report. When I looked back, it seemed like his head was in a slightly different position. I wasn't sure, maybe I had moved it without realizing. I forced myself not to think about it too much and continued with my work. But when I turned to grab some gloves, I was certain that the body had shifted position again. The chill returned with more intensity. I knew the mind could play tricks on you in places like this. After all, working among the dead isn't something the human brain assimilates easily. But this time it wasn't just a feeling. I was seeing it with my own eyes. I tried to continue with the procedure without dwelling on it. But the atmosphere in the morgue became heavier, almost as if there was someone else in the room. I kept glancing at the steel table, expecting to see the slightest movement. And then the light flickered. It was a quick flicker, just an instant. But in that brief moment when darkness invaded the room, I swear I saw something move on the gurney. My skin crawled. I didn't want to continue working without understanding what was happening, so I decided to check the security cameras. I went to the computer and searched for recordings from the past few hours. What I saw left me breathless. Every time I left the room or looked away, the body moved imperceptibly, but enough to be noticeable. Someone without experience might have attributed it to post-mortem reflexes, but I knew it wasn't that. At certain moments in the recording, when I wasn't in the room, a blurry shadow leaned over the corpse. It wasn't a camera malfunction. It wasn't a reflection. It was a figure that shouldn't have been there. I returned to the room with a feeling of oppression in my chest. I stood in the doorway, watching the body, waiting for something to happen. The air felt denser, and then the unthinkable occurred. The corpse exhaled a sigh. Not a simple escape of gases, not an involuntary sound of decomposition. It was a real sigh, measured and deep, as if the man on the gurney had just awakened. My legs froze. My entire body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. I watched as his lips seemed to move slightly, as if trying to say something. There was no sound, just the unbearable cold of the room and that sensation of seeing something I shouldn't see. Something that shouldn't be happening. I backed away from the gurney with my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to stay there another second. I grabbed the reports and decided to put the body in the refrigeration chamber. I wanted to get away from it as quickly as possible. I closed the door with trembling hands and tried not to think about what I had seen. When my shift ended, I said nothing. There was no point in trying to explain it. The next morning, the forensic pathologist who took the next shift reviewed the report. But while we were talking, he mentioned something that left me frozen. He told me that the initial report on the deceased had inconsistencies. The man hadn't died of a heart attack, as had been recorded. He had been declared dead without a proper autopsy. The real cause of his death was unknown. I was speechless. For an instant, my mind clouded with a terrifying possibility. What if he wasn't really dead when we received him? But no, there was no way someone could breathe after having been in refrigeration for hours. The only logical explanation was that something else was happening. Something I shouldn't understand. I never looked at the recordings again. I never examined that body again. All I know is that when I returned to the morgue days later, the corpse was no longer there. It had been sent to his family without further tests, without further explanations. But there's something I've never been able to get out of my head. When the corpse sighed that night, his expression was no longer serene. It was one of anguish, as if he had understood in that moment that he was trapped in a lifeless body. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. I've always been a logical person, though I've always been interested in the paranormal and those ghost stories people tell to scare each other or entertain themselves, as is my case. I've worked at a morgue for several years, and although at first it was hard to get used to the idea of being surrounded by corpses every day, over time everything becomes routine. Bodies arrive, get registered, get stored, and eventually leave. It's part of the process. But there are things that sometimes break that routine and make it clear that there's something beyond what we can understand. That Tuesday night in late November, everything was quiet. It was one of those long shifts where fatigue starts to weigh more than normal. It was almost 11:30 when I received a transfer from Riverside General Hospital, a man in his early 50s who had died of a heart attack at his home. A common case, nothing out of the ordinary. I took the documents, reviewed the data, entered the information into the system, and proceeded to take the body to the refrigeration chamber. Everything as always, until something made me stop. When registering the data in the system, I saw that this man was already there from the day before. The same name, the same age, the same cause of death. The first thing I thought was that someone had made a mistake, that maybe they had duplicated the data, or that some other corpse had a similar name. But something inside me told me to check for myself. So I went to the chamber and looked for the compartment where this man's body was supposedly located. And there he was. I opened the drawer and saw his face, his clothes, his identification tag with the same name I had just received. I slammed it shut and took a step back, trying to process what I was seeing. It couldn't be possible. I checked the documents again, reviewed the records once more. Everything matched. There were no errors. The body I had just received couldn't be there, because that man had already arrived the day before. I returned to the office feeling my hands sweat. I thought about calling someone, but what was I going to say? That I had the same body twice. I forced myself to think rationally, to find some logical explanation, but the more I tried to find one, the less sense everything made. I felt the need to check it one more time. Maybe I was tired. Somehow illogically, I thought I saw something that wasn't there. So I went back to the chamber, opened the drawer again, and saw exactly the same thing. And then there was a power outage. It lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to make me feel a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature of the morgue. When the light returned, something made me look toward the second drawer, the one with the newly admitted body. When I opened it, the air left my lungs. It was a different body. It wasn't the same man. The clothes were different. The face belonged to someone else. The data on the tag was completely different. I felt a sudden dizziness, as if my head couldn't process what it was seeing. I looked for the transfer documents, and there were the data I had reviewed before. But now they no longer matched. I didn't know what to think. It couldn't be an error if I had seen the body myself before the outage. I checked the records with my own eyes. The file with the first man's name no longer existed. The computer showed the data of the new body, as if the other had never been there. I breathed deeply and closed my eyes, trying to calm down. Something in my head told me to get out of there, not to try to make sense of what had just happened. I closed the drawer and returned to the office, feeling like I was in a bad dream, but everything was real. The next day, a veteran forensic doctor noticed my state and asked me if everything was okay. Without thinking too much about it, I told him what had happened, hoping he would laugh at me or find some logical explanation. But he didn't. He remained silent for a few seconds, looking at me with a serious expression, and said something that I still can't forget today. Sometimes, when someone dies unexpectedly, their death doesn't settle immediately. It's as if their spirit doesn't understand that it has already left this world and tries to repeat it. But reality itself corrects it. His words left me frozen. It didn't make sense, but at the same time, it was the only explanation that could fit with what I had experienced. Since then, every time I receive a body, I check the information twice. Every time I hear about someone who died alone at home, I wonder if their death was registered in reality, or if, at some point, someone else will have to repeat it. I never saw anything similar again, but that doesn't mean I stopped thinking about it. Maybe there are deaths that simply don't accept being definitive. The The strangest part is that I started keeping a personal log after that incident, not official records, just my own notes about unusual cases. 3 months later, I found an entry I didn't remember writing. It was about the same man, the first one I had seen duplicated. According to my handwriting, he had been brought in a third time, on a night I was supposedly off duty. But I have no memory of being there that night. I checked the official records, and there's no trace of a third admission. No paperwork, no computer entry, nothing. Just my own handwriting in a notebook, describing in detail how I processed the same body again, with the same peaceful expression, the same identification, the same everything. I've never figured out if I wrote those notes during some kind of fugue state, or if something else entirely happened that night. But I keep the notebook locked in my desk drawer, and sometimes, when the morgue gets too quiet, I can almost swear I hear the sound of a pen scratching across paper, even when I'm nowhere near my desk. My name is David, and I've been working as a forensic pathologist at the morgue of a small city hospital for almost a year now. It's a solitary job, but I got used to it quickly. It's not like they portray it in movies. Most of the time it's routine. Bodies arrive, reports get filled out, autopsies get done, and everything happens under an atmosphere of absolute silence. It's a place where death is the only certainty. Or at least that's what I believed before what happened to me. A few weeks ago, my supervisor told me they were finally going to hire a new janitor for the morgue. I worked most of my shifts alone, and although solitude didn't bother me, there were nights when the atmosphere felt heavier than normal. Having someone else to share the night shift with didn't seem like a bad idea. I'll introduce him to you tomorrow, so you won't think you're still talking to yourself, my supervisor said jokingly. I nodded and continued with my work. At night I had pending work on the computer, overdue autopsy reports, and a list of bodies that needed to be processed. The usual routine. Past 2 in the morning, while I was finishing writing a report, I saw someone pass by the hallway through the window of my office. It was a medium-height man, thin, wearing a somewhat worn gray uniform. It seemed logical that it was the new janitor. I waved at him as a greeting, but the man just stopped dead in his tracks and stared at me. He didn't respond with a gesture, didn't nod, didn't smile. He just watched me for a couple of seconds before turning the corner of the hallway and disappearing. His behavior seemed strange to me, but I let it go. Maybe it was his first shift and he wasn't in the mood to socialize. Not everyone arrives with the desire to talk, and in a place like this, silence is normal. When my shift ended, I didn't think about it anymore. I went home as always and slept without problems. I had no idea what I would discover the next day. When I arrived at the morgue the following night, my supervisor called me to introduce me to the new janitor. An older man with a kind face approached and extended his hand with a smile. "Nice to meet you, David. I hope we work well together." I returned the greeting out of simple politeness, but my mind was completely elsewhere. Something didn't fit. If he had just arrived, then who did I see in the hallway last night? I didn't say anything at that moment, but a chill ran down my spine. I asked, trying to sound casual, if anyone else had been in the morgue during the night. My supervisor shook his head. "No, nobody else was here yesterday. Why?" I didn't know what to answer. How could I explain what I saw without sounding paranoid? In the end, I just said I thought I had seen someone, but that it was probably my imagination. I tried to continue with my shift without thinking about it, but the feeling of discomfort wouldn't go away. I needed a distraction, so I decided to get ahead on the reports and review the bodies waiting for autopsy. I went to the refrigeration chamber and opened one of the compartments, checking the list with the names. When I looked at the body inside the tray, my stomach sank. It was him, the same man I saw in the hallway, with the same gray uniform, the same empty expression, the same figure. But the worst part wasn't that. When I checked the tag on his file, I realized something even more disturbing. That body had been there for several days. I felt the cold of the morgue much more intensely. This couldn't be happening. I couldn't have seen him the night before if he had been in refrigeration for days. My head tried to find a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. I checked his cause of death, massive heart attack. He had been found at his home sitting in a chair, already without vital signs. I slammed the tray shut and moved away from the chamber. My heart was beating too fast. The feeling of vertigo was uncontrollable. I leaned against the wall and tried to calm down. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe I had seen someone similar in the hallway and my mind was playing tricks on me. But then I remembered something, the look. It wasn't just having seen someone with the same uniform, the same build, the same face. I looked into his eyes. He looked back at me. He was aware of my presence. The air in the morgue felt dense, as if the place had changed temperature from one moment to another. My skin was cold, but at the same time, I had a cold sweat on my forehead. I wanted to get away from there, but my legs wouldn't respond. I forced myself to review the man's files. I searched through the reports until I found the exact time his body was admitted. It arrived 3 days before, not the night before. It couldn't have been him I saw in the hallway, but I saw him. I waved at him. He looked back at me. For the first time in my life, I felt a fear I couldn't explain. It wasn't just the fact of having seen a dead person wandering around. It was what it implied. Because if he could be there, standing, looking at me as if he were any other person, it meant his consciousness still existed. That somehow he was still trapped in this place, not understanding that he no longer belonged to this world. But the worst part of it all is that he managed to make contact. It wasn't a simple play of shadows or a reflection. He saw me and I saw him. We shared an instant that shouldn't have existed. Since that day, I haven't talked about the subject again. I continued working, fulfilling my shifts, trying to ignore the feeling that at any moment when I looked up, I might see him again in the hallway. Weeks have passed and he hasn't appeared again. But every time I'm alone, I feel like someone is watching me. I don't know if his spirit finally understood that he no longer belongs to this world, or if he's still here, trapped somewhere between life and death. What makes it worse is that I started researching his background. His name was Harold Finch, and he had worked as a night janitor at this very hospital for 15 years before his death. He died alone in his apartment on a Tuesday night, sitting in his favorite chair while watching the late news. The neighbors found him 3 days later when they noticed his mail piling up. According to the records, Harold had been scheduled to work the night I saw him. His shift would have started at midnight and ended at 8 in the morning. The same shift the new janitor was supposed to start. Wondered if maybe Harold didn't realize he was dead. If maybe he just came to work like he had every night for 15 years, walking the same hallways, following the same routine. And when he saw me, a living person who could see him, maybe he understood for the first time that something was wrong. If there's one thing I know for certain now, it's that the morgue isn't just a place where the dead are kept. Some presences simply don't leave, and sometimes, late at night when I'm alone with my paperwork, I still catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. Gray fabric disappearing around corners, the soft squeak of worn shoes on linoleum. But when I look directly, there's never anything there, just the echo of someone who forgot he was supposed to stop coming to work. My name is Daniel, and I worked at the morgue of a small hospital for almost 6 years. It wasn't the job I dreamed of when I was a child, but life led me there, and I ended up getting used to the routine. In the end, someone has to do it. At first, it gave me a bit of anxiety, but over time I learned to see corpses as simple records, names on a sheet that would soon be claimed by their families. They became routine. The corpses stopped seeming disturbing to me. They were inert bodies that were simply there, waiting for the next process. Most people imagine that the morgue is a grim place full of macabre stories, but in reality, it's quite a peaceful environment. It's not difficult work, just methodical and solitary. But there was one night when I understood that death can be more complicated than we think. And although I've tried to give it a logical explanation, there's something deep in my mind that tells me I'll never find one. I've told this story only once, and that was to someone who didn't believe me. And I understood because I wouldn't have believed something like that either if someone else had told me. But I lived it. I saw it with my own eyes, and although years have passed, there are nights when I still think about it. It was a shift like any other, quiet, with the hospital in silence, and with only a few doctors and nurses on duty. That night, I had to receive one more body, a 43-year-old man. According to the report, he died at his home due to a domestic accident. The preliminary examination showed nothing out of the ordinary, so all I had to do was finish the paperwork and transfer him to the refrigeration chamber. I did everything as always. I checked the data, verified that the body matched the record, and began to prepare him. I don't know exactly when I started to notice that something was out of place. At first, it was a strange sensation, as if someone else alive was with me in the room, but I was alone in the chamber. I thought it was fatigue, but later when I looked away to write something in the record, I felt that something had changed. I looked at the body again, and for a moment it seemed like his arm wasn't in the same position. I stared at him for a few seconds and tried to convince myself that I had simply moved it without realizing it. It wouldn't be the first time I did things automatically due to routine. But as the night progressed, every time I walked away for a few minutes and came back, I had the sensation that the body had moved a little more. It wasn't much, just small variations in position, but enough to make me doubt. To make sure, I decided to review the security camera recordings. Everything in the morgue was recorded, so if I had moved it without realizing it, the camera would show it. I rewound the video and saw exactly what I had done. Everything seemed normal. Until I left the room. That's when I saw it. Every time I left the room, the body moved. Just a little, but it moved. These weren't post-mortem spasms. It wasn't muscular reflex. The way the position changed was too precise, as if someone was repositioning it. The worst part was when I advanced the video frame by frame. At a moment when I had left for several minutes, I saw a shadow. It wasn't clear, just a blurry silhouette leaning over the corpse. There was no one else in the morgue, no one else in the hospital who had access to that area. The only card registered that night had been mine. I remained motionless, watching the screen with my stomach in knots. The shadow stayed there as if doing something to the body, and then disappeared just before I entered again. I tried to calm myself by telling myself it could be a reflection, an error in the recording, but the feeling in my chest told me it wasn't so. I returned to the room where the corpse was and stared at him, looking for something out of place. And I found something I was 100% sure wasn't there before. Marks on the neck. I'm completely sure because I would have noticed them in the first check. They were pressure marks, as if someone had tried to strangle him. My heart was beating so hard I felt like I was going to faint. I had seen thousands of corpses in my life, bodies in all possible states, but I had never seen one that changed like that after death. I wanted to do something, review the file again, make sure I wasn't losing my mind. But all I did was close the refrigeration chamber and get away from there. And I didn't approach again until my shift ended. The next day passed until I returned to my shift and found the forensic pathologist, whom I greeted normally expecting to receive the same response. But he asked me if everything had been in order last night. I told him yes. Why was he asking? And he responded, there was an error in the body's information. The cause of his death wasn't due to an accident falling down the stairs, as the report said. The man was strangled. To this day, I don't know what happened exactly. They never found a culprit because there were no fingerprints or clues of any kind that demonstrated the presence of another person. I always wonder if someone alive actually made those marks, or if someone, or something, finished killing him after he was dead. What torments me most is thinking that maybe it wasn't the first time something like that had happened. How many bodies had I received without noticing they weren't really alone? The case haunted me for months. I started paying closer attention to every body that came through our doors, looking for signs of tampering, unexplained marks, anything that seemed out of place. I began keeping detailed notes of every corpse's condition upon arrival, photographing unusual positions or marks before beginning any procedures. 3 weeks later, something else happened that convinced me I wasn't losing my mind. A young woman was brought in, supposedly a suicide by overdose. Clean case, straightforward paperwork. But when I checked her the following morning before the scheduled autopsy, I found something that made my blood run cold. Fresh injection, marks on her arms that hadn't been there when she arrived. Not the old track marks from drug use that were already documented. These were new, made with surgical precision, as if someone had been conducting experiments on her body during the night. I immediately called the forensic pathologist and showed him what I'd found. He was skeptical until I showed him my photographs from the night before, clear evidence that these marks hadn't existed when she was admitted. That's when he told me something that changed everything. Daniel, he said, his voice unusually serious. I've been doing this job for 22 years. In that time, I've seen 3 other cases like what you're describing. Bodies that were altered between admission and autopsy. Each time, the alterations revealed the true cause of death. He pulled out a locked file drawer I'd never seen opened before. We've suspected for years that someone was using our morgue after hours. Someone with medical knowledge, someone who knew how to access the building without triggering alarms. We think they've been finishing what they started, completing murders that were initially disguised as accidents or natural deaths. The implications hit me like a freight train. Every unexplained movement, every shadow on the security footage, every altered body position suddenly took on a sinister new meaning. We weren't dealing with something supernatural. We were dealing with something much worse. Someone very much alive who was using the morgue as their personal laboratory of death. Someone who made sure their victims were truly, completely dead, no matter what the initial cause appeared to be. That night we set up a trap. hidden cameras, motion sensors, and I volunteered to work late, pretending everything was normal while security waited in an adjacent building. At 2:17 in the morning, the motion sensors triggered. What we caught on camera was a figure in scrubs and a surgical mask, moving through the morgue like they owned the place. They had keys. They knew exactly which bodies to check, which cases had been marked as suspicious deaths, rather than the natural causes or accidents listed on the official reports. We never caught them. By the time security responded to the silent alarm, they were gone, vanished into the maze of hospital corridors like they'd never been there at all. But we had proof. Enough proof to start an investigation that would eventually uncover a conspiracy involving falsified death certificates, covered-up murders, and a killer who had been using the morgue as their finishing ground for years. The most chilling part, when we reviewed years of security footage, we found evidence of at least 17 visits. 17 times someone had entered our morgue to complete their work on bodies that weren't quite dead enough for their liking. I quit that job 2 months later. Some knowledge is too heavy to carry, and some places hold too many secrets to ever feel safe again. As a retired forensic medical examiner, I have countless stories from my years working in morgues across the Midwest. This particular incident happened just a few years before my retirement, but it feels like it was yesterday. That night, I was alone in the last morgue where I worked. My colleague, who usually covered the same shift, had requested time off because her husband had been in a car accident and was hospitalized. I understood completely and told her not to worry about it. I was swamped with work that evening. Earlier that afternoon, several bodies had arrived following a horrific collision just outside Des Moines. A sedan had crashed head-on into a passenger van carrying a church group returning from a weekend retreat. The impact was devastating, and unfortunately, there were many casualties. In the sedan was a family of 3, a father, mother, and their 4-year-old daughter named Emma. Tragically, both the mother and little Emma lost their lives instantly. Only the father, who had been driving, survived, though he was in critical condition at the hospital. I had to process all the bodies, complete autopsies, fill out paperwork, the whole procedure. I decided to start with little Emma. No matter how professional you become, it's always heartbreaking to see children who had so much life ahead of them. It hits even harder when you have kids of your own. I wheeled Emma into the autopsy room to begin the examination. The other bodies, including her mother's, remained in the holding area, waiting their turn. I started my work with Emma, but suddenly I heard noises coming from the holding room. As I mentioned, the facility was empty except for me. The security guard was stationed outside at his post, but I didn't think much of it initially and continued with my work. But a few minutes later, I heard the sounds again. This time, they sounded like soft moaning, very faint but unmistakable. I decided to investigate. I walked down the hallway and entered the holding room, but there was nobody there, nobody alive, I mean. So I turned off the lights and stepped out to the reception area to take a look around. I also took the opportunity to use the restroom. When I returned to the autopsy room where I had been working on Emma, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were faint stains on the floor that appeared to be blood, forming a trail. I also noticed that Emma had a fresh blood stain on her right hand. Something that definitely wasn't there when she arrived at the morgue. Emma had died from severe head trauma, but her small body had been otherwise intact. It was her mother who had suffered multiple severe injuries throughout her body. I was completely confused because I couldn't figure out where these bloodstains on Emma's hand could have come from. But I didn't want to dwell on it too much. I simply decided to continue with my work since I still had so much to do. I was almost finished with Emma's examination when I heard those sounds again, noises and moaning coming from the holding room. This was the last straw for me. I decided to go check once more. What I saw left me so shaken that to this day, I still feel the same impact whenever I remember it. There was Emma's mother's body, with one leg hanging down below the gurney she was lying on. She also had one hand protruding from under the sheet. But that's not how we had left her. She had been completely positioned on the gurney with her hands and feet properly placed and covered entirely with the sheet. To be honest, it did shock me greatly. I also noticed that blood was dripping from her exposed hand. Call me crazy if you want, or unprofessional, but I was certain that it had been her who had gone to see her daughter in the autopsy room and had held her hand. That explained the bloodstains on the floor and on little Emma's hand. I decided to lock that holding room while I finished with Emma. I don't know how I managed to continue working that night after what had happened. I suppose my years of experience finally backed me up. But more than fear, I felt moved, because this was a mother who wanted to be with her child. After that, the sounds continued, so when I placed Emma in the cold storage, I decided it was her mother's turn so they could be together. When I brought Emma's mother to the autopsy room and began working on her, no more sounds came from the holding room. That's when I was more certain than ever that the whole time it had been her. A mother who simply wanted to be with her daughter. Working in forensic medicine, you see death every day, but you rarely witness love that transcends even death itself. That night, I learned that a mother's bond with her child is stronger than anything, even stronger than death. My name is Arthur, and I want to share my story with you. I've been a forensic medical examiner for 10 years now, working in different morgues throughout New England. It's become routine for me to see all types of bodies and work with them during the early morning hours, which is when my shifts typically are. But when I started working at this particular morgue in a small Massachusetts town, everything was different. I covered the night shift along with another colleague. One night we were working as usual when, in the early hours of the morning, we received the body of an elderly woman in an advanced state of decomposition. The officials who had picked up the body told us she was a reclusive old woman who had no family, and that neighbors had discovered she had died due to the foul stench emanating from her house. We proceeded to perform the autopsy and all the legal procedures required. When we finished, we placed her in the cold storage. After that, my colleague and I took a break. We were chatting when, for some reason, the atmosphere began to feel very heavy. Both he and I started feeling unwell anxious, and we both agreed on the same thing. Something wasn't right. We were finishing our coffee when suddenly we heard a door open. The sound came from the cold storage units. The creaking of those doors was unmistakable. He and I looked at each other and remained silent for a few seconds. He asked me if that door was from the cold storage, to which I replied yes, and we went to investigate. We went immediately to see what had happened, and when we arrived, we saw that the only door that was open was the old woman's. He asked me with some concern if I had properly closed the door, to which I responded yes, that I had even put the padlock on it. There was no way it could have opened by itself. I wanted to tell him no, but he was already very nervous since he had very little experience as a forensic medical examiner. The truth is, I was also somewhat tense because nothing similar had ever happened to me in any morgue, and I didn't believe in paranormal things. But being there, everything felt very different. I can't explain to you how heavy the atmosphere felt, and especially with what had just occurred. But I didn't want to scare my colleague anymore, so I told him not to worry, that probably that door was malfunctioning due to its age. I tried not to give it much importance, and we continued working. I closed the door again where the old woman's body was, and we left. As the hours passed, he went to the bathroom when suddenly I heard him shout my name. I ran to see what was happening. When I entered the bathroom, he was staring toward the stalls with a look of terror I had never seen before. I asked him what had happened, and he responded, the old woman, just pointing toward a bathroom stall. He could barely speak. He was in a state of shock. I asked him who he was talking about, which old woman. He said the one who arrived that night. He had seen her while he was washing his hands. He saw her through the reflection in the mirror. She was watching him from the doorway of that bathroom stall. I didn't know what to think. The only thing I could do was try to calm him down, telling him that he was letting his imagination run wild because of what had happened earlier. That old woman was already dead. We know it's impossible for her to even move. But he kept staring toward the bathroom stall, terrified, and he swore to me that he had seen her. It was her same face with a blackened eye, exactly as she had arrived. I felt terrible seeing how he looked. I told him to take the night off, not to worry, that I would cover for him while he went to rest. Maybe that's what he needed. He agreed, but before leaving, he told me to please be very careful, that he was sure of what he saw. The truth is, I was somewhat scared because I could see the fear in his eyes. But I had to return to work since other bodies had arrived. About an hour passed while I was performing another autopsy when the lights began to flicker, and seconds later, the power went out completely. I turned on my phone's flashlight and headed toward where the fuse box was located. But as I turned the corner in the hallway, there she was. The old woman was sitting on one of the gurneys in the hallway. She wasn't moving, just sitting there, staring at me fixedly. Then she let out such a sinister laugh that it makes my skin crawl every time I remember it. My only reaction was to turn around and run. Just then, the lights came back on. I stopped and turned back around. The old woman was no longer there. It was as if she had never been there. I no longer wanted to stay there alone, so I called the doctor who owned that morgue and told him what had happened to us and that I was leaving the premises. He arrived immediately. I was outside waiting for him because I didn't want to continue inside alone. He asked me if I was okay, and I told him yes, but obviously I wasn't, and I could no longer continue working like that. So we went in to check what was happening. We entered and headed to where the old woman's body was, and there she was, exactly where I had left her, as if nothing had happened. The doctor let me leave, and he stayed in my place. The next day at night, I arrived at the place, and the doctor told me that things had also happened to him, and that he could hear a woman's laughter coming from that room. So he personally went to the old woman's house to ask her neighbors if she didn't have family or someone who could claim her body so we could remove her from the morgue. When speaking with the neighbors, he learned what was really going on. They told him that the old woman had no family, friends, or anyone who visited her. Nobody wanted to get close to her because she was a witch. She practiced black magic, and you could always hear wailing in her house at night, along with unpleasant odors and smoke coming out of there every night. They said she tortured animals, and the neighborhood children said that the old woman was always spying on them while they played soccer in the street. Once, she even tried to take away a 5-year-old girl, but her older brother saw her, pushed the old woman, and took his little sister away. The girl's parents never did anything out of fear they had of her, since it was known that thanks to her witchcraft, people who had problems with her had died. She was a very evil and dark person. Just by walking in front of her house, you could feel that sensation of bad vibes and anguish, something that didn't feel right, the neighbor said. She also told me that the best thing was to cremate the body, that nobody was going to claim it, and that if we buried it, her spirit would remain tied to this world, continuing to sell her soul. So we had to cremate her before it was too late, and something very bad happened to us inside the morgue. So that same night, the old woman was cremated, and we never again experienced that sensation of fear, anguish, and bad energy in the morgue. I worked 5 more years there, and nothing like that ever happened again. But without a doubt, it's something that marked me. That old woman made me realize the evil that can exist in people, even after death. I had wanted to share this story for a long time, but I hesitated to do so out of respect for the victim. I want to share it while omitting details and doing so anonymously and with great respect for her and her family. I've been a forensic medical examiner for 9 years now. I've worked in different morgues throughout my career and have handled 2 cases that became somewhat high profile. I've been to various cities where they request my services to help clarify cases that remain unsolved. And there have been several occasions like this. In this particular story, I was called from another state because they had a case they couldn't solve and needed my help. It involved the body of a young woman they were going to exhume so I could perform the autopsy again, since the family wasn't satisfied with the official cause of death. The official reason given by the district attorney's office didn't sit right with them. This wasn't the first time I had worked with an exhumed body, so I was confident that everything would go well and hoped I could help this family. When I met them, they begged me to find the true reason for their daughter's death. They just wanted to find peace, and for their daughter to have it too. This young woman had been found by her husband, hanging in the house where they lived together. He called the authorities, and they determined that she had taken her own life. But the parents didn't believe that version of events. They knew their daughter didn't suffer from any psychological problems, and in fact, she had future plans. For example, she was very excited about becoming a mother, and was planning for it that very year when she died. Her husband was a loving man who cared for and worried about her. He was also present when I spoke with the parents, and also agreed to have his wife's body exhumed. He signed the papers for this to be carried out and to start the process as soon as possible. The day arrived. That afternoon, I showed up at the morgue where I was going to examine this young woman. I work better alone, so I waited until nighttime when the place would be empty and began my work. It seemed like the district attorney's office was right, because I found exactly the same cause of death. I was already taking off my gloves since I had finished my work when the young woman grabbed my hand. I know it's something difficult to believe, but this really happened. I remember that I remained motionless, still with the young woman's hand on top of mine. I was stunned, trying to understand what had happened. I refused to believe that the young woman had moved by herself, and it wasn't any kind of spasm since she had been dead for weeks. Her body was already in an advanced state of decomposition, so it wasn't easy for me to have gone through all of that. I locked up the place and went to my apartment where they had put me up for those days. The young woman's body stayed in the morgue and would be buried again the next day. I arrived at that apartment completely confused and a little scared. Nothing like this had ever happened to me throughout all my working years. It didn't make any sense. I went to shower so I could rest and deliver the report the next day. But while I was showering, I heard noises outside the bathroom, inside the room, which seemed very strange to me since I was there alone and had secured all the doors. So I turned off the shower to be able to listen better, since maybe I had been mistaken because of everything I had on my mind. But when it was completely silent, I heard footsteps in the room again. I took my towel and came out as quickly as I could, very cautiously in case there was some criminal who had broken into the apartment. But when I came out to check the room, it was empty. I knew they weren't my imagination. I had really heard very clear footsteps. So I got dressed as quickly as I could and went down to check the first floor. But there was nobody there either, and everything was locked exactly as I had left it. I went back upstairs and locked myself in the room. I went back into the bathroom to brush my teeth and finally be able to go to bed and sleep. But while I was rinsing my mouth, I felt something so strange that I had never felt before. I felt the presence of someone behind me. My skin got goosebumps for no reason. I didn't want to lift my head toward the mirror in front of me because I felt terror at seeing something that would make me scream like never before. I stayed there with my head down and my hands resting on the sink for a few seconds that felt eternal. I closed my eyes, squeezing them with all my strength, while fear invaded my entire body. Little by little, I lifted my head, and when I was ready, I opened my eyes. It was her, the young woman I had performed the autopsy on that day. She was standing behind me, but she wasn't as her body was found, already almost unrecognizable. She wasn't as she was when she was alive either. I saw her through the mirror. She was looking at me with her tearful eyes and the saddest look I had ever seen in my entire life. This lasted for seconds. My heart was beating so fast that I felt it would come out of my chest. When I turned my head back, she was no longer there. I started crying. Never in my life had I seen a ghost or anything strange with someone I had performed an autopsy on. But then I understood that this young woman was trying to tell me something. She wanted me not to give up until I found the truth. That's why she had followed me to my apartment. I got dressed and took my things at that very moment. I headed back to the morgue where I spent that night. I took the young woman's body out of the freezer again and examined her all night long, until finally I found something I hadn't been able to notice before. The young woman had been suffocated before she was hanged. She hadn't taken her own life. Someone else had done it. I was so shocked to realize what was happening. This completely changed the investigation. The young woman just wanted justice. I delivered the report the next day. When the family found out, they became furious with the district attorney's office for not doing their job properly, and I almost didn't do mine either. They demanded that they look for the person responsible, but it didn't take long for them to figure out who it had been. Because when he learned about my report, the young woman's husband fled the city, and the story tells itself. He was the one who had done that to the young woman, to his own wife, and then hanged her so everyone would think she had taken her own life. Unfortunately, this is something more common than we think. The young woman got the justice she so longed for because they did manage to find that man, and he confessed everything. But I was left with a bittersweet feeling about the whole thing. On one hand, I was happy because I had managed to clarify the case and give justice and peace to that young woman and her family. But I also felt sad and still shocked by what had happened to me. That young woman sought me out after death so I could provide her with the justice she yearned for. I'm left with the satisfaction that she now rests in peace, and with this experience that I can now tell, but that still gives me goosebumps when I remember it. I'm a forensic medical examiner and have worked in different morgues throughout my life. I've been practicing this profession for more than 20 years now, and of course, with all the experience I've gained over time, I also have many stories that have happened to me while doing this work. Some are mine, and many others that dear colleagues have told me. Since these places are very prone to paranormal occurrences, if I can call them that, I must say that we are prepared very well, both professionally and emotionally. We must be as skeptical as possible and always perform this work with a cool head, because otherwise the job would become hell. I decided to tell you this story because it's the one that still resonates in my head after so many years since it happened. I was younger then. I remember I had just been transferred to a morgue in a very small town about 2 hours from my city in upstate New York. Everything was going normally, but one afternoon a deceased person arrived. It was an 86-year-old man who had died of natural causes, and after performing the autopsy, we had to cremate him since his family had decided on cremation. After a few hours, the body was ready to be transferred to the crematorium. A colleague and I took him there. We placed the body inside and started the cremation process. But not even 10 seconds had passed when we heard horrible screams from a man coming from inside the crematorium. I shouted to my colleague to turn it off, and we removed the body, which was already almost charred. But what shocked us most was that the body had its arms raised upward, as if asking for help, and his face had his jaw open with an expression of terror. We stood there for a few seconds without being able to react, because the man was already dead when we put him in there. He had even gone through the autopsy, and the body was already in the first stage of decomposition before putting him in the crematorium. My colleague was very surprised, but he told me, "Let's finish cremating him so he can rest in peace." We put him back in and finished cremating him. We didn't hear anything else after that. But I still can't forget those horrible screams full of pain, nor the way his body looked when we took him out of there. The doctor who worked there, who was an older man with a lot of experience and was like my mentor, told me not to try to find an explanation. He said that sometimes these things happen and that I should stay calm, because that man had been dead for more than a day when we put him in the crematorium. There was no point in dwelling on the matter, since it was obviously something without explanation, or paranormal, if you will. The experience taught me that death isn't always the end we think it is. Sometimes, consciousness lingers in ways we can't understand or explain. That man's final moments in life might have been filled with such terror or pain that his spirit couldn't let go, even after his body had long since ceased functioning. What disturbed me most wasn't just the screams. It was the realization that somewhere, somehow, that elderly man was experiencing agony, even though medically, scientifically, it should have been impossible. It made me question everything I thought I knew about death and what comes after. I hope his soul is finally at rest now. My name is Alejandro, and the experience I want to share with you didn't just happen to me, but also to a colleague named Armando, who became a very good friend while working at the morgue I'm about to tell you about. We're both forensic medical examiners, and back then we were younger and had very little time practicing this profession. But both of us were passionate about it. We met right there. He had started working a little before I did. I have to say that it was surprisingly easy for me to get the position. And when I told Armando that they had hired me, he said he urgently needed help for the night shift. Sometimes he couldn't finish his work on time, especially when many bodies came in on a single day, and he had to examine them all. I'll tell you right away that this job was the most difficult for me, and working as a forensic examiner in Detroit during that era, when gang violence was happening almost every day, was not easy at all. You're never prepared enough to see all of that for the first time. There were bodies that arrived in pieces or with their faces completely disfigured. The saddest part was that they weren't all adults. We also had to see many young people who, because of their poor choices and the violence they were involved in, had their lives taken in indescribable ways. The morgue was saturated day and night. The medical examiner vans arrived constantly with more bodies. But on one particular occasion, Armando and I found ourselves working alone. Things were relatively quiet, so to speak. We had just examined several bodies that night and had put them in the freezers, but many others were outside waiting for a freezer space to become available. The place was packed, so we left them on gurneys in the same room where the freezers were, while we continued working in the adjacent room. But while we were doing this, I remember we heard the freezer doors begin to creak. It was the same sound as when you open or close them. I went to take a look, but noticed that they were all closed and there was nothing out of the ordinary. "What happened?" Armando asked me. I told him I didn't know, that all the doors were closed and there was nothing unusual. Both of us made faces like we didn't know what was happening, but we continued working. We didn't have time to speculate about anything, so we just let it pass. A short time passed when we heard that characteristic creaking of those doors again. Both of us fell silent, but that wasn't all. Now, we had also heard one of the doors slam shut. Armando and I ran to the next room, and in my case with some fear, but we were surprised to find that when we got there, the door to that room was locked from the inside. We tried to force it, but we couldn't. We also couldn't see anything inside since that room had no windows. We didn't have the key to that room because the doctor who worked there in the mornings was the one who had it. We would lock up from the inside when we left, and the doctor would open in the mornings. At night, when we arrived, the door was already open, so there was no need for us to have a key. Armando asked me if we should call the police. I replied, "For what? No one could have gotten in. There's nobody alive in there." He looked at me very skeptically, as he always was, since we're trained to be that way. But sometimes things really happened that were inexplicable and without any logic, like this one. We went back to continue working in the next room. I told him, "We have to act like nothing is happening. Let's continue working, and you'll see that the door will open again." He asked me how I could be so sure, and I replied, "The people who are in there weren't good people. They lost their lives doing horrible things, and they can't move on. I'm sure they want to scare us." He told me how I could believe in those things, that I couldn't dedicate myself to this, and at the same time believe in ghosts. But of course you can, because when something paranormal happens to you, you have no choice but to believe. I had experienced things in my childhood. I remember my grandmother was very spiritual, and she always told us that people who lose their lives and were bad people in life get trapped in a kind of limbo, lost without knowing where they are, often being harassed by malignant beings that inhabit there. And I could prove it, because while I was telling Armando all this, we heard a man's crying coming from that room. Armando began to get very nervous. I had never seen him like that, because he was usually very cold. Whatever he saw, he always had the same expression. He was very professional, and didn't believe anything that didn't have scientific explanation. But you could see in his face how his expression was changing while that wailing wouldn't stop. He told me we should go check. Both of us left the room and approached the door, and when I tried to put my ear against the door to try to listen, it opened by itself. The lights in that room were off when we had left them on, as they should always be while we were there. Armando tried to turn on the light, but he was so nervous that he couldn't find the switch. I had to go in without light. I walked a few steps, but I can't explain to you the heavy vibe that was felt in that place, like I had never felt in my entire career. I could feel the anguish and desperation of these lost souls. I found myself surrounded by bodies that had met a very tragic end, and many weren't even complete. It's simply inexplicable what it felt like to be standing right there in the dark, only feeling all these horrible energies. Armando finally managed to turn on the light, and the first thing we saw was that one of the bodies that was in the freezer was completely out. It was a man's body, and part of his nose that Armando had sewn to try to reconstruct his face was undone. We couldn't explain how this had happened, but Armando had to sew it again, and we put him back in the freezer. Without realizing it, dawn was already breaking, and our shift had ended. Armando went home very shocked by what had happened that night. I wasn't as much, because, as I mentioned, it wasn't the first time inexplicable things like this had happened to me. The next night we showed up to work, as we normally did. Armando told me he had barely been able to sleep, that what had happened had really affected him, and he felt guilty about it, because we're supposed to not let ourselves get influenced and not be affected by what we see there. It's simply work, and that's it. But we're human beings, and many times, no matter how professional we are, we can't help having these feelings when things like this happen. I tried to calm him down and told him that night was going to be different, that we should focus on our work and stop thinking about it, because I believe we attract what we think and what we fear. So that's what we did. Around 2 in the morning, we received the body of a 5-year-old boy who had died in a hospital from an illness, and they had sent him to us because they no longer had space. We received him and put him in that room to wait so we could perform his procedure. Since Armando and I were busy with another body when he arrived. Not even 5 minutes had passed when we heard a lament again in that room, but now from a small child. Armando made a face of terror. I told him I would go, that he should stay working, because I knew he no longer wanted to get involved in that. So I walked a few steps to get to that room, which was still full of those bodies of bad people, so to speak. And when I opened the door, the first thing I saw was the bag where that little boy's body was, completely open, exposing the small body, who had his face frowning as if he had made some expression of terror. Without thinking twice, I closed the bag again and took the small body out of there and brought him to where we were working. Armando asked me what I was doing, that it wasn't his turn yet. I replied that I couldn't leave that poor little boy in that room, surrounded by all those bad energies that were there, because I was sure they had made him cry and could do something bad to him, just like they had done with that man's nose. Armando shut me up, saying not to say anything else. He was somewhat annoyed, and I could see it on his face. He was in denial. He didn't want to believe what was happening in that place since all those bodies had arrived. That night no more laments were heard, but there were several noises that we didn't know what was causing them. But neither of us was going to check anymore. We both agreed that we wouldn't pay any more attention to them, because maybe that's what they wanted. Days and nights passed like this, and little by little that room emptied out. But there were many bodies that weren't claimed by anyone, so they went directly to the mass grave. During those days, the strange noises at night diminished. The bad vibes stopped being felt, and Armando was the first to notice it. I hate to admit it, but you were right. Since all those bodies of that people who did horrible things left here, all of this calmed down. I just nodded and sighed, and then we continued working normally. Those days were difficult, because sometimes bodies would arrive again from people who had lost their lives in confrontations, or even people who had taken their own lives, and we knew what would happen. We knew the chaos that would bring to the place. But it was no longer something that disturbed us. In fact, we were getting more and more used to it. I was afraid of becoming colder and colder, because after everything you see and live through in this job, there's no going back. I think that those who want to dedicate themselves to this and live in a place where atrocious things happen daily have to be very well prepared psychologically. This isn't for everyone, and that's a fact. My name is Fatima, and I've been a forensic medical examiner for several years now. Throughout my career, I've experienced some situations in the morgue because it's true that many things happen there. It's very common since many victims die in very tragic and sudden ways. And I do believe that souls who die that way can't rest in peace, so they stay here wandering among us. I know that as a doctor, I shouldn't believe in those things, should stick more to science and what has explanation. But there are many things I've gone through in these places that make me believe that there is something beyond our understanding. Things that have no explanation. This story is one of the many I have to tell. I was working alone in that morgue on the night shift. Only the security guard and I were there. Around 2 in the morning, the body of an 18-year-old girl arrived. She had been hit by a car just a few hours earlier. We filled out the paperwork, and the paramedics left. I proceeded to perform the autopsy, and I don't want to go into detail, but she had severe injuries throughout her body. I felt very bad for the girl. After that, I went to the security guard to ask if anyone had come to claim the body yet, to which he answered no, that no one had called either. I took the opportunity to go to the bathroom, and from far away I heard the guard talking to someone. I hurried because I thought some family member had arrived to claim the girl's body. I dried my hands and went to the waiting room, but the guard was alone. I asked him who had arrived. He told me that a girl had come in and told him she was lost and asked if he could help her get home. She looked disoriented, but he couldn't abandon his workstation. He just explained to her where she could take a taxi that would take her right to her house, and she left. I didn't think much of it and went back to work. Everything was going normally like any other day. I was preparing other bodies to deliver to their families when the body of the girl who had just arrived fell off the gurney without any explanation. I just heard the thud of the body hitting the floor. I was very scared, to be honest, because there was nobody and nothing that could have knocked her down. It was impossible for her to fall by herself. I went to ask the guard for help to put her back on the gurney since I couldn't do it alone. The guard agreed, and when we entered the room, the guard saw the girl and froze. He didn't say anything, but I could see the fear he had in his eyes. I asked him what was wrong. He responded with a very shaky voice that this was the girl who had come to ask him for help to take her home just a few moments ago. I was paralyzed. I didn't know what to tell him. The only thing that came out of my mouth was, "Are you sure?" He told me yes, that he was completely sure. She even had the same tattoo on her right arm. It was her. Together we lifted her and put her on the gurney. We left that room and could only comment that it was a lost soul who still didn't know what had happened to her and just wanted to go home. At that moment, more than fear, I felt great sadness since she was a very young girl whose life had been taken away from her. In my experience working with the deceased, I've learned that sudden, violent deaths often leave spirits confused and disoriented. This young woman probably had no memory of the accident. One moment she was walking down the street, perhaps heading home from work or visiting friends. And the next moment, she found herself in an unfamiliar place, not understanding why everyone seemed to ignore her except for that brief moment with the security guard. The fact that she had asked for directions home spoke to something so fundamentally human, that desire to return to safety, to familiarity, to the place where we belong. Even in death, that instinct remained strong within her. What struck me most was how polite and lost she seemed according to the guard's description. She wasn't angry or vengeful, just confused and seeking help. It made me think about how many spirits might be wandering around us, not malicious, just displaced and trying to find their way back to something they can no longer have. I often wonder if she eventually found her peace, if she somehow made it home in whatever form that takes for souls who have passed on. I hope she did. Nobody, especially someone so young, should remain lost forever. In my first job as a forensic medical examiner, several unusual things happened to me. Although I didn't get scared easily, since I had prepared for this for many years, there were times when certain things puzzled me, like what I'm about to tell you. Back then, I worked the night shift. I only had one assistant, who was a young man doing his medical residency. We were the only ones who stayed at night in the morgue. I have to say that once you get used to it, it becomes very peaceful, since it was just me and my headphones or conversations with my assistant at that time. One night, he and I were performing an autopsy on the body of an elderly woman. During that time, the medical examiner's team arrived with another body and placed it on a gurney next to where the woman we were working on was. Apparently, it was the body of a young man who had been hit by a car while riding his bicycle. I continued working on the woman's body while my assistant prepared the young man's body. We were both talking, and I had my back to him, doing my work. I remember I was asking him how things were going with his girlfriend, because the night before he had told me they had fought over a jealousy issue. He responded that everything was going very well, that he loved her very much, but that it was going to hurt him that he would never see her again. I asked him why he was saying that if he was telling me everything was going well. He started crying very painfully, and when I heard his laments, I immediately turned to look at him. But my assistant wasn't there. Only the body of that young man who had just arrived was there. I felt my legs begin to tremble. It's one of the few times I've felt fear in my work. Suddenly, I saw my assistant enter the room, acting as if nothing had happened, telling me he had received a call from his mother and had to go out to answer it, apologizing for not letting me know. He saw my pale and shocked face and asked me if something was wrong. But I told him no, that everything was fine since I didn't want to scare him. On the contrary, I should set an example for him since he was just a student. That morning I went home very puzzled. I was sure that the one who had answered me had been that young man who was hit by the car. But after feeling fear, I felt sorry for him and his girlfriend, a story that depresses me every time I remember it. The experience left me thinking about the power of love and loss, and how these emotions might transcend death itself. This young man had clearly been thinking about his girlfriend in his final moments, or perhaps his spirit was still processing the realization that their relationship had ended not by choice, but by tragedy. What struck me most wasn't just that he had somehow communicated with me, but the profound sadness in his voice when he spoke about never seeing her again. It made me realize that the dead might carry with them the same emotional burdens we do in life: love, regret, unfinished business. I wondered about his girlfriend. Did she know yet what had happened? Was she perhaps waiting for him to come home, maybe still angry about their fight, not knowing that their last argument would truly be their last? The thought of her eventual discovery of his death, and how their final interaction had been a fight rather than words of love, haunted me. Sometimes I think about whether spirits linger because they have something important left unsaid. Maybe this young man's spirit was desperately trying to communicate a final message of love to his girlfriend, but could only find my assistant and me as conduits for his voice. It taught me that our work in forensic medicine isn't just about determining causes of death and processing bodies. Sometimes we become unwitting witnesses to the deepest human emotions that persist even after the heart stops beating. We see not just the end of life, but the continuation of love, regret, and longing that somehow transcends physical death. That night changed how I approached my work. I became more aware that each body on our table was someone who had loved and been loved, someone whose absence would create a void in other people's lives. It made me treat each case with even more respect and dignity, knowing that somewhere, someone was grieving the loss of the person lying before me. My name is David, and I'm about to share an experience that happened to me and my colleague Marcus during our early years as forensic pathologists in Detroit. This was back in the mid-2000s, when the city was experiencing some of its darkest times. Gang violence was at its peak, and our morgue saw more bodies in a single week than some facilities see in a month. Marcus had been working the night shift for about 6 months when I joined the Wayne County Medical Examiner's office. The pay was decent, but they were desperate for help, especially for the overnight hours. Most people couldn't handle the psychological toll of working alone with the dead in the early morning hours, but Marcus seemed to thrive in the solitude. When I met him during my first week, he struck me as incredibly professional and unflappable. Nothing seemed to rattle him, not the most gruesome gunshot victims, not the bodies that came in pieces, not even the children who'd been caught in crossfire. He approached every case with clinical detachment and scientific precision. The job was harder than anything I'd prepared for in medical school. Detroit in those days was a war zone, and we saw the casualties firsthand. Bodies arrived around the clock, drive-by shootings, drug deals gone wrong, execution-style murders that left families destroyed and communities terrorized. The refrigerated storage units were constantly full, and we often had to leave bodies on gurneys in the main examination room, waiting for space to open up. It was during one particularly busy week in February when things started getting strange. We'd processed 14 bodies in 3 days, all victims of what police believed was an escalating turf war between rival dealers. The victims were mostly young men in their 20s, but they died violently, some tortured before being killed, others dismembered in ways that suggested the killers wanted to send a message. Marcus and I were working our usual night shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. The morgue was located in the basement of the county building, a maze of windowless rooms connected by narrow hallways. The main refrigeration unit was in the back, with dozens of individual compartments stacked 3 high along the walls. Around 2 a.m., we were in the examination room, working on 2 separate cases, when we heard it, the distinctive creaking sound of the refrigeration unit doors opening and closing. It was a sound we knew well, the heavy metallic groan of the old hinges that needed oiling. I walked over to check, thinking maybe the temperature fluctuations were causing the magnetic seals to fail. But when I got there, all the doors were firmly closed and the temperature readings were normal. "Everything okay?" Marcus called from the other room. "Yeah, just thought I heard something," I replied, though I had a nagging feeling that something wasn't right. We went back to work, but 20 minutes later, we heard it again, multiple doors opening and closing in sequence, followed by what sounded like one of them slamming shut hard enough to rattle the nearby equipment. This time, Marcus came with me to investigate. We stood in the doorway of the refrigeration room, listening carefully. Everything was quiet, all doors secure, but there was something different about the atmosphere in the room. It felt heavier somehow, charged with an energy that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Maybe it's the building settling," Marcus suggested, but I could tell he was unsettled too. His usual confidence seemed shaken. We tried to return to our work, but we'd barely been back in the examination room for 5 minutes when we heard another sound that stopped us cold. A low, anguished moaning coming from the refrigeration unit. Marcus and I looked at each other, and I saw something I'd never seen before in his eyes: genuine fear. We both knew that sound wasn't mechanical, it was human. When we reached the refrigeration room, the door to the hallway was closed. I tried the handle, but it was locked from the outside. This was impossible. We were the only ones in the building, and neither of us had a key to that particular door. The day shift supervisor always unlocked it in the morning, and we locked up from the inside when we left. "This doesn't make sense," Marcus muttered, his scientific mind struggling to find a logical explanation. We tried forcing the door, but it wouldn't budge. That's when I shared something with Marcus that I'd never told anyone at work. Growing up in rural Alabama, my grandmother had been what people called sensitive. She could sense things that others couldn't, and she taught me that violent deaths sometimes leave marks on the places where they occurred. She always said that people who died with hatred in their hearts, or who'd caused terrible suffering, couldn't move on easily. "You can't be serious," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. I told him I thought the men we'd been examining, drug dealers who tortured and killed innocent people, who destroyed families and communities, were trapped somehow. Their negative energy was keeping them anchored to this place, and they were trying to intimidate us, to make us afraid. As if in response to my words, we heard it again, not just moaning this time, but what sounded like a man crying, deep sobs of anguish and despair coming from behind the locked door. Marcus went pale. This man who'd performed autopsies on burned bodies without flinching, who'd reconstructed faces that had been destroyed by close-range gunshots, was trembling as we stood in that hallway, listening to sounds that shouldn't exist. I approached the door and placed my ear against it, trying to determine exactly where the crying was coming from. The moment my ear touched the wood, the door swung open on its own, so suddenly that I stumbled forward into the darkness. The lights in the refrigeration room were off, though we always left them on during our shift. Marcus fumbled for the switch, but the room was so dark he couldn't locate it immediately. I stepped further into the room, guided only by the dim light from the hallway behind us. The atmosphere in that room was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't just cold from the refrigeration units. There was a psychic chill that seemed to seep into my bones. I could feel the presence of tortured souls, men who died violently and were now lost in some kind of spiritual limbo, unable to find peace. When Marcus finally found the light switch, we saw something that defied explanation. One of the refrigeration compartments was standing wide open, and the body inside, a man who'd been shot execution style 3 days earlier, was partially pulled out onto the sliding tray. The careful sutures that Marcus had used to close the autopsy incisions on his face were torn open, leaving gaping wounds that hadn't been there before. We had no choice but to return the body to its proper position and resuture the damaged areas. By the time we finished, dawn was breaking over Detroit, and our shift was officially over. Marcus went home deeply disturbed by what he'd witnessed. He'd built his entire career on facts and evidence, on the belief that everything could be explained through science and logic. What we'd experienced challenged everything he thought he knew about death and what came after. The next night, we reported for duty with a mixture of dread and curiosity. Marcus admitted he'd barely slept, that every sound in his apartment had made him jump. I tried to reassure him that we should focus on our work and not feed into whatever negative energy was present in the building. Around midnight, we received a new arrival, a 5-year-old boy named Tommy, who died from injuries sustained in a car accident. The hospital had run out of space in their morgue, so they transferred him to us for temporary storage until his family could make arrangements. We placed Tommy's small body in the same refrigeration room where we'd experienced the disturbances the night before. The room was still filled with the bodies of the gang members, men who'd lived violent lives and died violent deaths. Less than 10 minutes after we'd secured Tommy's body and returned to our work, we heard it, the sound of a child crying heartbroken sobs that seemed to echo through the morgue's concrete walls. I knew immediately what was happening. I told Marcus to continue with his current case while I handled this situation. Those lost souls, trapped and angry, were tormenting the innocent child who'd been placed among them. When I opened the refrigeration room door, I found Tommy's body bag partially unzipped, revealing his peaceful face twisted into an expression of terror. I couldn't leave that sweet child in there with those malevolent presences, so I moved him to our main examination room, where Marcus and I could watch over him. "What are you doing?" Marcus asked, clearly frustrated. "It's not his turn yet." I explained that I couldn't leave Tommy alone with the negative entities that were haunting that room. Those men had probably frightened him, just as they damaged the other body the night before. Marcus stared at me for a long moment, then shook his head. "I can't listen to this anymore. We're forensic pathologists, not ghost hunters." But even as he protested, I could see the doubt in his eyes. He'd witnessed things that his scientific training couldn't explain, and it was eating at him. That night passed more quietly, though we still heard occasional unexplained sounds, footsteps in empty hallways, doors opening and closing, whispers that might have been the wind through the building's ventilation system. Over the following weeks, the situation gradually improved as the bodies of the gang members were either claimed by families or transferred to the county's Potter's Field for burial. With each departure, the oppressive atmosphere in the morgue lightened noticeably. Marcus was the first to acknowledge what had happened. "I hate to admit it," he said one night as we cleaned up after a relatively quiet shift, "but ever since those bodies were removed, everything's been normal again." I nodded, understanding that this admission was difficult for him. His entire worldview had been challenged by experiences that couldn't be quantified or peer-reviewed. Those were dark times in Detroit, and we continued to see the victims of the city's violence on a regular basis. But we'd learned to recognize the signs when malevolent spirits were present, and we developed strategies for dealing with them, clearing negative energy, showing respect for all the dead regardless of how they'd lived, and protecting the innocent from those who remained trapped by their own hatred and violence. The work changed us both. It's impossible to witness that much death and remain unchanged, but experiencing the supernatural aspects of our job added another layer of complexity to an already challenging profession. I worried about becoming desensitized to human suffering, but those encounters with restless spirits reminded me that death isn't always an ending. Sometimes it's just a transition to something else entirely. For anyone considering a career in forensic pathology, especially in a city plagued by violence, I'd say this: be prepared not just for the physical and emotional toll of working with the dead, but for the possibility that some of them aren't as gone as you might think. The job requires not just scientific training, but psychological resilience and an openness to experiences that can't always be explained by medical textbooks. We serve the living by speaking for the dead, but sometimes the dead have their own voices, and they're not always quiet. My name is Marcus, and I work as an embalmer at a small funeral home in rural Louisiana. The nature of my work has made me witness to many supernatural occurrences over the years. Some have been casual, almost anecdotal experiences, while others have left me haunted for weeks, even months. But the story I want to share goes far beyond anything I've encountered before, and that's why I consider it worth telling. I won't be too specific about my exact location, but let's just say I'm from a part of Louisiana where voodoo and folk magic are still very much alive and practiced, both for good and for ill. Being in a rural community makes these practices even more common. I respect everyone's beliefs as long as they don't harm others, but, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. This all happened in September of last year. I was at the funeral home as usual, preparing the body of an elderly gentleman who had died of a heart attack. I take my work very seriously because, for me, it's not just about beautifying the dead. It's vitally important to me to make them look identical to how they appeared in life. That's why, if it's not too much trouble for the family or friends, I usually ask for a photograph of the person during a happy moment. That way, I can prepare them exactly as they're remembered. It makes the farewell so much easier. I know this from personal experience. I was just finishing up with the gentleman's preparation when Marcus, the new morgue assistant, I'll call him Kevin, came in pushing a gurney with a body covered by a thick black cloth. I asked him why the unusual covering, but he didn't seem to understand my question at first. "It's an elderly woman," he said with a trembling voice as he wheeled the gurney to one of the refrigerated compartments and quickly slid it inside. I watched him the entire time, and he looked extremely tense. How can I describe it? It was as if he didn't want to be in contact with her for very long. He even had the poor manners to shake his hands and body vigorously as soon as he closed the compartment door. I called him out on it, told him not to do that she was someone's wife or mother and didn't deserve to be treated with disgust. But he corrected me immediately. "It's not disgust, Marcus, it's fear." "Fear, why?" "Well, I don't know if you believe in these things, but that woman was a practitioner of the dark arts. I won't lie, I didn't particularly care what the woman might have been. Why fear her? Whatever she did it while alive." I asked about the black cloth again. He told me that the family insisted she be kept covered, and if possible, cremated with the cloth still on her. Kevin was too nervous, and his urgency to leave frustrated me. I asked if the family was still outside, and he said her sister-in-law was probably still in the office. I left the morgue and headed to the front of the funeral home. There I found an elderly woman about to leave. I asked if she was related to the woman who had just been brought in, and she nodded very slowly, looking me up and down. This made me somewhat uncomfortable because it felt like she was analyzing me with her gaze. I told her that, if they wanted, I could prepare the body so they could say goodbye before the cremation. She just shrugged. You can do it if you want to. Well, it's really more for you all, I clarified, incredulous at her indifference. And if you'd like to give me a photograph and the clothes she liked best so I can dress her properly. She's already wearing her clothes, and we want her exactly as she is right now. Cremate her with the cloth and with whatever she's holding in her hands. The tone this woman used was firm and very cold. I was surprised to hear that she was holding something, and I tried to tell the woman that during cremation, the deceased cannot have metallic objects with them, but she didn't listen to me. Or rather, she ignored me. I went to the office where the funeral home owner was. I told him what had happened, and he said that as long as it wasn't metal, I could burn whatever the family was requesting. He was generally a rather indifferent man, so his response didn't surprise me. I went back down to the morgue, and as soon as I entered, I noticed that the woman's compartment was open. I thought Kevin had closed it poorly in his haste, and I approached to close it properly. When I was just a few feet away, I heard a voice coming from inside, more like a moan. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I stayed silent for a moment. But I've been working in this field for years, so I reminded myself that bodies sometimes make sounds. I closed the compartment and continued with my work. At that moment, there were only 2 bodies in the morgue, the gentleman, who was almost ready, and her. I was concentrated on my work, and I like to work in silence, so the only sound that usually accompanies me is the air conditioning. That's why I was startled to hear a metallic knock on a door. I thought it was coming from the entrance door and went to open it, but no one was there. Just then I heard 2 more knocks, but they were coming from the compartments. I sighed heavily, understanding that the old woman's spirit was restless. As I mentioned, I've witnessed many paranormal events, and I won't pretend to be skeptical when the evidence is right in front of me. However, one never gets used to it. There's always something inside you that makes you feel fear, that lets you know you're facing something supernatural, and even something dangerous. I took a deep breath, trying to control the trembling in my hands, and said in the firmest voice I could manage, "I'm coming to you now, don't be impatient. We'll be finished soon." I called Kevin shortly after to have him take the gentleman to the chapel where they would hold the wake. He was a well-loved man, and many people from town came to say goodbye that afternoon. I went upstairs for a moment to get coffee from a small cafe where they usually served soup and something warm to the mourners. When I came back down to the morgue, the woman's compartment was open again. I crossed myself, gathered my courage, and went to prepare her. Her cremation was scheduled for around 6 in the evening, since the relatives didn't want to wake. I moved her to a gurney and then placed her on the work table. You have no idea how frightened I was to remove that black shroud from her. My imagination presented me with the worst scenarios. The old woman jumping from the table and attacking me, or the body already being mummified. I even thought she might speak to me or something like that. I quickly removed the shroud and squeezed my eyes shut, but after a few seconds, I opened them and returned to reality. It was just the body of a grandmother with a gentle face, wearing a black veil and a dress of the same color. Her expression was peaceful, and I calmed down considerably. I began preparing her body for cremation, and everything went well until I saw her hands and remembered what the woman had told me earlier. The elderly woman had her hands crossed over her abdomen, and I noticed she was holding something. Again, the same fear that had invaded me when I was about to remove the shroud came over me as I realized I needed to see what she held in her hands. This time, however, my fear was justified. Between her hands, she clutched what I can only describe as a ball of flesh and hair with 2 small bones protruding from it. I felt nauseous and understood Kevin's feelings, that fear and distrust he had when moving the gurney to the morgue. Now, I need to explain something about the cremation process. Normally, the deceased are cremated with their clothing and can have fabrics, photographs, or other symbolic objects with them. But under no circumstances should metallic objects or ceramics enter the cremation furnace. It was my responsibility to examine that mass of flesh and hair to determine if it contained any metallic objects. Needless to say, I didn't want to do it, and I remembered what Kevin had told me. That woman was a practitioner of dark magic, and that thing was a spell. I didn't want to touch it, but I also didn't want to burn it. My situation was quite complicated, and I kept thinking about my options while preparing the body. Finally, when she was ready, I crossed myself, thinking that what I decided was best, not only for professional reasons, but because, if it was true that this woman practiced dark magic, then that thing was a spell and couldn't be good. I grabbed some tweezers and tried to grasp that mass of flesh, but the old woman's hands clenched it tightly. I'd never seen rigor mortis so strong. Eventually, piece by piece, I managed to break it apart and throw it in the trash. I never touched it with my bare hands. I didn't feel comfortable with that thing in the morgue's wastebasket, so I took advantage of having to call Kevin to take her to the crematorium and decided to take out the trash myself. I left the morgue, and I hadn't taken 5 steps when a loud scream made me stumble and fall. I looked back at the door in disbelief, and I swear I saw a shadow move through the door's window. I ran like crazy to the outside of the morgue, threw the bag in the dumpster, and saw Kevin nearby. I begged him to accompany me to put the woman back in the compartment since there were still a couple of hours before the cremation, and he agreed, albeit reluctantly. When we entered, I found her in almost the same position, though her hands were slightly different at the sides of her body. I didn't comment on this to Kevin, and simply covered her with her black shroud and put her in the compartment. I didn't enter the morgue again until the time of cremation when they came to take her. I was honestly very curious, and although it wasn't my responsibility, I went to the furnace area to see if Kevin needed anything. I thought the woman's family would be there, or at least the woman I had spoken with earlier in the afternoon. But no one was there, only Kevin, standing in a corner, anxiously checking his watch. I went in to keep him company, and the wait became lighter for both of us as the minutes passed until it was finally time. No one came to say goodbye to her, so we carefully moved her into the furnace, and I let Kevin do his job operating it. I didn't know how to handle it, so I just watched. I'll never forget what happened next. As soon as the body began to incinerate, a sharp, uncontrolled scream made us both jump. Kevin immediately turned off the furnace and pulled the old woman out. Her mouth was open and her expression had changed. Now it was full of rage and her eyes were wide open. Kevin begged me to check her pulse, thinking she might still be alive, but I assured him she wasn't. I had worked with her for an hour, maybe 2. There was no way she could be alive. However, he insisted, and I knew that until I proved it to him, he wouldn't continue. Fearfully, I raised my hand and took her pulse in front of him. Although she felt warm, there were no vital signs. Kevin reluctantly put her back in the furnace, and as soon as he began to incinerate her, the screams were heard again. Kevin didn't know what to do and ran out of the crematorium. I didn't have the strength to move my legs, and I heard her scream full of rage for a couple more seconds until silence fell. A few minutes later, the funeral home owner arrived with Kevin and other curious people from the gentleman's wake. They asked us what was happening, and I couldn't speak. Kevin, for his part, asked if they hadn't heard the screams, but they all looked at each other, confused. Only Kevin and I witnessed what happened, and few of those present believed us. I went home immediately, and fortunately my wife believed me and helped me drain all the stress of the day. Now, Kevin had to keep working, and he told me what happened next. 2 hours later, the old woman's body had been reduced to ashes, and the woman from the morning returned to collect them. He gathered the ashes and placed them in a rather simple urn, without crosses or any religious symbols. Fortunately, the boss was there as a witness and saw when the woman, upset, began asking where what she had been holding in her hands was. Kevin shook his head since he didn't know what she was talking about, and the woman flew into a rage, cursing and trying to attack Kevin. Our boss had to stop her, call Martin from security, and shortly after, the town police. We later learned from the policeman who came to help us that this woman was also a practitioner of dark magic, and that the woman we had cremated had no family or friends who could claim her remains. The ashes were stored for weeks at the funeral home, waiting for someone to claim them. During all that time, the atmosphere became heavier and more gloomy than it already was, and everyone saw silhouettes and shadows out of the corner of their eyes, until the city hall of our locality decided to send the remains to a common grave. All this time, I've wondered what could have provoked such a violent reaction in both women, but it's quite obvious that it was because I removed that spell of flesh from her hands. Something inside me tells me I did the right thing, but at the same time, I'm afraid that someday those women will take revenge against me. Besides, I wonder, what were they planning to do? Who were they planning to hurt? I'll never know. My name is Dr. Michael, and I'm a forensic pathologist. For the past 12 years, I've worked in the morgue of a private hospital here in Chicago, though I prefer not to say exactly which one. You know how it is. I want to avoid any kind of retaliation. I don't think the hospital administration would be too pleased to hear ghost stories being told about their facilities. I remember it was February because my mentor, Dr. Sarah, had put a small Valentine's Day decoration in our office. She's always maintained a cheerful and optimistic attitude, which helps a lot in a workplace like this. That little heart-shaped ornament made me smile because it clashed so much with our usual gloomy environment. Anyway, it was a quiet afternoon, and we were each doing our paperwork when the body of a young adult arrived. The assistant peeked through the office door to notify us, and I told him to leave it in the autopsy room, not to put it in any of the refrigerated compartments, because we'd be heading there shortly. The young man continued on his way, and a few minutes later, I heard the sound of his sneakers on the hallway floor. I knew he had left, and no more than 3 minutes passed when I heard a very strong cough coming from the autopsy room. Dr. Sarah must have noticed that I was startled because she immediately asked me, "What's wrong? Have you never heard someone cough before?" I stared at her and asked if she hadn't realized that the assistant had already left. She remained calm and just smiled at me, as if to say that yes, she also had ears. Then she stood up, and I followed her to the adjacent room. For those who have never been inside a morgue, it's a fairly simple place. Imagine a room with some gurneys and work tables, and in the back, refrigerated compartments to store the bodies of the deceased. The layout can vary, but the elements are almost always the same. We entered, and the body was already on one of the morgue tables, covered by a sheet. We prepared to do our work, and suddenly I heard that raspy cough again. I turned to look at Dr. Sarah, but she didn't even flinch. She kept reading the report as if nothing was happening, and for a minute I thought I had gone crazy. Fortunately, Sarah was understanding, and before we began, she simply said to me, "Stay calm. You're going to see strange things, but don't get scared." I was already quite nervous. I was a novice back then and had never encountered anything strange, so I didn't know what to expect. We approached the body and uncovered it. It was a fairly young man, about 25 years old. He had arrived at the hospital without vital signs, and no family member had come with him. I don't want to get too technical with terminology or the steps of an autopsy, so I'll just say that we began examining the body, looking for the possible cause of death of this young man. He looked quite healthy, and at first glance, there was no apparent reason why someone like him would die. I was examining his left arm and was concentrated on my work when suddenly his hand gripped my arm tightly. I jumped backward, but even so, I couldn't free myself from his grip. Sarah looked at me again, and her calmness was contagious. Little by little, I pried his fingers apart and put his arm back in place to continue with the work, assuming it was just a muscle spasm. A few minutes later, his body shook violently on the gurney. I wiped the sweat from my forehead, making an effort not to show my fear as I watched his arms fall to his sides, and even saw him make the motion of sitting up. Sarah maintained control and gently laid him back down, put his arms in their place, and continued as if nothing had happened. I was very tense because I had never seen post-mortem spasms so violent and vivid, so coherent. Again, nothing seemed to provide an answer for why or how this person had died. I proceeded to examine his throat, and suddenly his eyes opened. I was frightened, not just by that, but because I clearly saw how his gaze pointed toward me. I've always been a bit of a coward, and I know I can easily become suggestible, but that wasn't suggestion on my part. His eyes looked at me, and again I felt him grab my wrist. I froze, and as if the autopsy room wasn't cold enough already, I felt my blood freeze. Fortunately, I wasn't alone. Several seconds passed until Sarah, with her calm hand, closed the young man's eyelids, saying in a gentle voice, "Stay calm. We're going to find out what happened to you." As I said, I was quite a novice at that time, and I stared at her without knowing if she was talking to me or to the deceased. But when I felt the young man's hand release its grip on me, I understood that Dr. Sarah knew many more things about this profession than I could imagine. I stepped back and sat for a few minutes, watching her work with the same calm and good humor that characterized her. I took a deep breath, remembering what she had told me, and returned to work, understanding that she had seen all of this coming even before entering the autopsy room. It was my duty to stay calm and do my job as best as possible, until Sarah had the opportunity to explain to me what was happening. What I can assure you is that during the time I worked with that deceased person, everything that happened escaped normality. I even began to think it was a prank, because he moved almost as if he were alive. Although gradually, he calmed down as Sarah spoke to him in a kind tone, explaining each step of what we were doing and the medical reasons behind it. This young man's muscles never became rigid, even when we had been working with him for 4 hours. I know that rigor mortis can take up to 8 hours or a bit more to set in. But this young man's body not only remained manageable, but I could also feel a certain warmth to the touch. I discreetly checked his pulse a couple of times, thinking he might be alive, but Sarah noticed and said very seriously, "This young man passed away hours ago. Don't confuse yourself." I nodded slowly and continued with my work. We found some signs of recent violence, like bruises and scratches, but nothing that justified his death. It was a mystery to both of us what had happened, and suddenly a subtle whisper caught my attention. The whine. I stared at Sarah to see if she had also heard it. Bodies can make sounds similar to words and emit noises, but this is due to gases that accumulate after death. However, a complete phrase was something peculiar. Sarah, however, remained calm and did what was necessary to analyze the contents of his stomach. He had consumed wine hours earlier, and a deeper examination led us to determine the reason for his death. The young man had been poisoned with arsenic. We immediately reported that the young man on the table was the possible victim of a homicide, and in little more than half an hour, 2 forensic experts arrived to continue with the work. Meanwhile, we finished the paperwork for this young man's transfer, as they would surely take him to the forensic morgue for more in-depth analysis. Within an hour, they took him away, and both Sarah and I could finally return to the office. As soon as I sat at my desk, I let out a deep sigh. My back and head hurt, and I couldn't stop my hands from shaking. I stared at her, waiting for answers, and she didn't wait long to give them to me. Sometimes these things happen, Michael. You have to get used to it. I tried to inquire a bit more, but Sarah couldn't give me a clinical explanation of what had happened. She only told me that sometimes there are deceased people who arrive very agitated. Maybe because of how violent their deaths were, how unexpected they were, or on the contrary, because they knew what was coming and couldn't prevent it. In those cases, the deceased person's body appears more agitated or rigid than usual, and it's something I had to learn to deal with. Whispering to them, talking to them calmly, usually helps a lot in those cases. She doesn't know why, but that's how it is. I stopped to think about those words, and I couldn't help but think that all of this had a supernatural origin. I knew that Sarah was an atheist, and it confused me quite a bit that, having witnessed something like this on more than one occasion, she remained so skeptical. I asked her if she didn't believe that this was a manifestation of something spiritual, something that escaped our earthly world, and she answered something I'll never forget. You can interpret these situations however you want, Michael. What matters is that you do your job well, and that you help the people who lie on that table make a quick transition, or like today, help them find answers and achieve justice. I understood exactly what she meant, and we continued working. Without a doubt, the best mentor I've ever had. As for the young man, I didn't know what happened to him until several months later, when the forensic experts visited us regarding the death of a young woman from a drug overdose. I took the opportunity to approach one of them and asked about that case. I noticed the confusion in his expression, but after a while, refreshing his memory, he remembered the case and told me what happened. The deceased had inherited his parents' apartment. From the family nucleus, only he and his younger brother remained, but since his younger brother was very troubled and still a minor, the parents decided not to leave him anything so he wouldn't squander it. His older brother tried to help him, but it was impossible, and all he did was demand what rightfully belonged to him. These fights led him to harbor a lot of resentment toward his older brother, and the desire to take the entire inheritance led him to plan his brother's death. He knew that if he murdered him with a firearm, it would be obvious that it was him, so he had the idea of poisoning his brother. He spoke with some street friends, and they advised him to use arsenic. They told him where to find it, and sooner rather than later, he managed to poison a glass of wine that his brother was drinking with his girlfriend. He confessed shortly after, when he finally became aware of the horror of his actions. I can only imagine how terrible that young man's death must have been. Sick, but knowing deep down that there was something abnormal, that it was too much of a coincidence. I hope his soul is resting in peace. Since then, I've experienced a couple of similar cases. Although Sarah moved to another country, what I learned from her helped me a lot. Now, I stay calm and help the deceased as much as I can. It's even become my habit to speak in a low voice, to keep company with the souls that cling to their bodies on their journey to the beyond. My name is Sarah, and I've been a nurse for over 20 years now. I retired last winter, but there's one incident from my career that still haunts me to this day. It happened at Riverside General Hospital in Portland, Oregon, back in 2018. I had been working at Riverside for about 8 months when this occurred. The hospital had a contract with the local homeless shelter, so we frequently received bodies of people who had passed away on the streets, folks with no family, no one to claim them. It was always heartbreaking to see these souls end up in our morgue, with nobody to mourn them. The morgue staff consisted of Dr. Patricia Chen and Dr. Marcus Webb, both seasoned professionals in their 60s who alternated shifts. Since Riverside was a smaller facility, we rarely needed both doctors on duty simultaneously. I was responsible for transporting bodies from the emergency department to the morgue, and I had developed a strict policy. I never left a body unattended until one of the doctors arrived to take custody. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon in November when the paramedics brought in a man who appeared to be in his 50s. He was a homeless individual who had been found deceased near Pioneer Courthouse Square. The police estimated he had been dead for several hours before being discovered. I wheeled him down to the morgue on the gurney, following my usual protocol. Dr. Chen arrived within about 4 minutes. She had been finishing up paperwork in her office. Together, we transferred the body onto the examination table, completed the initial documentation, and then moved him into refrigeration unit number 7. I watched as Dr. Chen secured the heavy metal door, hearing the distinctive click of the locking mechanism. The afternoon progressed normally. I completed my rounds, filed the necessary reports, and handled my other responsibilities. Around 4:30, roughly 3 hours after we had stored the body, I returned to the morgue with Dr. Chen to begin the preliminary examination procedures. As we walked down the sterile corridor toward the morgue, I noticed Dr. Chen seemed unusually quiet. She had just returned from her lunch break and was fumbling slightly with her keys, something I'd never seen her do before. The morgue had a strict security protocol. Only Dr. Chen and Dr. Webb had access keys, with a backup set secured in the administrative office under lock and key. When we entered the morgue, my blood ran cold. Refrigeration unit number 7, where we had placed the homeless man just hours earlier, was standing wide open. Dr. Chen dropped her clipboard, the metal clattering against the polished floor as she rushed to the unit. She pulled the drawer out completely, and we both stared into the empty space where the body should have been. Her face went pale as she turned to look at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. "Sarah," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly, "no one else has access to this room. The security logs will show that only you and I have been in here today." I approached the refrigeration unit slowly, my heart pounding. As I got closer, something on the floor caught my attention. There, directly in front of the open unit, was a single, wet footprint, not a shoe print, a bare foot. The outline was clear and distinct, as if someone had stepped in mud and water before walking across our pristine morgue floor. What made it even more unsettling was the direction the footprint was facing. It wasn't pointing toward the exit, as you might expect if someone had broken in and stolen the body. Instead, it was oriented toward the refrigeration units, as if whoever, or whatever, had made it was walking deeper into the morgue. Dr. Chen knelt down beside me, studying the mysterious print. "Sarah," she said quietly, "I need to tell you something that one of my professors shared with me years ago in medical school. He said that sometimes, when people die alone, when they know no one will come looking for them, when they're certain no one will grieve their passing, they don't wait around. They find their own way to wherever they're supposed to go." She stood up slowly, her hands shaking as she closed the empty refrigeration unit. I never believed it until now. But if what we're seeing is real, if what my professor told me was true, then this man knew nobody was coming for him. He left on his own terms. The implications of her words sent chills down my spine. We stood there in the eerily quiet morgue, both of us trying to process what we had witnessed. Dr. Chen was right about one thing. No family members ever came forward to claim the body. No missing person reports were filed. No one ever asked about him. For the next week, I couldn't shake the image of that solitary footprint from my mind. I kept expecting someone to contact the hospital, someone to demand answers about their missing loved one. But the silence was deafening. Dr. Chen and I never spoke about the incident with anyone else. We filed a report stating that the body had been released to the appropriate authorities, which wasn't technically a lie. We just didn't specify exactly which authorities had claimed it. To this day, I wonder about that man. Did he really walk out of that morgue on his own? Was it possible that in death, some people possess the ability to decide their own fate? All I know for certain is that I witnessed something that defied every logical explanation I could think of. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in bed trying to fall asleep, I think about that wet footprint on the morgue floor. And I can't help but feel a deep sadness for someone who left this world so completely alone that even in death, he had to find his own way home. My name is David Rodriguez, and I've been working as an embalmer here in Phoenix, Arizona, for the past 15 years. Before I opened my own funeral home, I worked for a man named Harold Brennan at his small mortuary facility on the outskirts of the city. The building has since been demolished and turned into a shopping center. But back in 2012, it was where I learned my trade. Harold's mortuary was unusual in its layout. Unlike most funeral homes that are integrated into larger buildings, this one was a standalone structure separated from the main hospital by about 200 feet of desert landscaping. You had to walk along a winding concrete path, past some struggling palm trees and desert shrubs, to reach the front entrance. The building itself looked more like a converted ranch house than a professional mortuary, but Harold had equipped it with everything necessary for our work. It was just Harold and me working there, no other staff, no cleaning crew during the day. The janitorial service came in every evening after we left, which meant that during operating hours, we were the only two people who should have been on the premises. I'll never forget the morning of Tuesday, March 13th. I was arriving for my 8 o'clock shift, walking along that familiar path toward the building, when movement in one of the high windows caught my eye. These windows were positioned near the ceiling, probably 10 feet off the ground, and were quite narrow, more for ventilation than for looking out. Through one of these windows, I saw what appeared to be a person's head and shoulders. Someone was looking out at me, watching me approach the building. My first thought was that Harold had arrived early and was checking to see who was coming. He sometimes got to work before me, especially when we had a busy schedule. But as I got closer, something felt wrong. The figure in the window didn't wave or acknowledge me in any way. It just stared. And I realized that to be visible in that window, someone would have to be standing on something quite tall, a ladder, a table, something substantial. Harold was in his 70s, and I'd never seen him climbing on anything, let alone positioning himself to look out of a window that served no practical purpose. As I watched, the figure slowly withdrew from view, disappearing back into the interior of the building. The whole thing probably lasted only 10 or 15 seconds, but it left me with an uneasy feeling I couldn't shake. I reached the front door and tried my key, but found it was already unlocked. This wasn't entirely unusual. Harold sometimes forgot to lock up when he left the previous evening, though he was usually more careful about security. Before I could even step inside, I heard Harold's voice behind me calling out, "Morning, David. Beautiful day, isn't it?" I turned around to see him walking up the path, carrying his usual thermos of coffee and looking like he'd just arrived from the parking area. My heart skipped a beat. "Harold," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "were you already inside?" He looked puzzled. "Inside? No, I just got here. I stopped at the diner for breakfast, remember? I told you yesterday I'd be running a few minutes late today." I stared at him, then back at the building. I could have sworn I saw someone in the upper window. I thought it was you checking to see who was arriving. Harold's expression grew more serious. He set down his thermos and pulled out his keys. "David, let's go inside and take a look around." We entered the building together, Harold leading the way. The mortuary consisted of a main preparation room, a smaller office space, and a storage area. Everything appeared to be exactly as we had left it the night before. We walked through each room methodically, checking behind equipment, inside closets, anywhere someone might conceivably hide. The building was empty, except for the body of an elderly woman we'd been working on, Mrs. Patterson, an 83-year-old who had passed away from natural causes. She was lying on our main preparation table, covered with a white sheet, exactly where we had positioned her before leaving the previous evening. "Well," Harold said, scratching his head, "there's definitely no one else here, David. Maybe you saw a reflection or a shadow. The morning light can play tricks sometimes." I wanted to believe him, but I knew what I had seen. As we began our morning routine, preparing to continue our work on Mrs. Patterson, Harold seemed to be studying me carefully. "David," he said eventually, "I need to tell you something. Mrs. Patterson has been moving more than usual since we brought her in. Now, don't get alarmed, you know that post-mortem movement is completely normal. Bodies shift, settle, release gases. It's all part of the natural process." I nodded, familiar with these phenomena from my training. But Harold continued, "She's been moving more than I'd typically expect. Yesterday evening, after you left, I came back to check on something I'd forgotten, and I found her in a slightly different position than we'd left her. Her head had turned to the side, and one arm had shifted. A chill ran down my spine as Harold spoke. I glanced over at Mrs. Patterson's covered form on the table. "Harold," I said slowly, "do you think it's possible that what I saw in the window was—" He held up his hand. "David, I believe you saw something. I've been in this business for 42 years, and I've learned not to dismiss things just because they don't make immediate sense. Whether it was Mrs. Patterson or something else entirely, I don't know. But if it was her, then we need to approach our work with even more respect and care than usual." We continued our preparations in relative silence, both of us occasionally glancing toward the high windows. Around mid-morning, we heard a distinct creaking sound from the preparation table, the kind of sound metal makes when weight shifts on it. We both looked over to see Mrs. Patterson's body had indeed moved, not dramatically, but noticeably. Her head had turned toward the wall, and her right arm had shifted position. "There," Harold said quietly, "you see, she's still settling." But as I stared at Mrs. Patterson's peaceful face, now turned in profile, I felt a shock of recognition. The angle of her head, the way her features were positioned, it matched perfectly with what I had seen in the window that morning. I never mentioned this realization to Harold. Some things are better left unspoken. But for the remaining 3 years I worked at that mortuary, I never again arrived at work without a careful look at those high windows. Mrs. Patterson was claimed by her family 2 days later. They held a beautiful service for her, and she was laid to rest in a cemetery across town. After that, the unexplained movements in our facility returned to normal levels. Harold retired the following year and sold the property to developers. Before the building was demolished, I drove by one last time to say goodbye to the place where I'd learned so much about both life and death. As I sat in my car looking at the structure, I found myself wondering about Mrs. Patterson. Had she somehow been checking on us that morning, making sure we were taking proper care of her? Or was there something else, some presence in that building that I'll never fully understand? I may never know the answer, but I do know this. Working with the deceased has taught me that the boundary between life and death isn't always as clear as we might think. Sometimes people linger a little longer than expected, and sometimes they have their own ways of letting you know they're still around. I've been working at Denver General Hospital for 8 years now, currently as a morgue technician, though I started as a nurse's aide. There's one incident from 3 years ago that I'll never forget, no matter how much time passes. It changed the way I think about death, about consciousness, and about what might linger after we take our final breath. It was a Tuesday night in October, around 1:15 in the morning. I was working the overnight shift with Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a seasoned pathologist who had become something of a mentor to me. The hospital was quiet, except for the usual sounds of equipment humming, and the distant chatter from the emergency department upstairs. The ambulance arrived with a victim from a horrific traffic accident on Interstate 25. The young woman was only 22 years old. Sarah Michelle Chen was her name. She'd been driving home from a late dinner with friends when an 18-wheeler ran a red light and T-boned her sedan. The impact was devastating. Her boyfriend, who had been in the passenger seat, survived with serious injuries, but was stable in the ICU. Sarah hadn't been so fortunate. The paramedics had worked on her for over an hour at the scene, but she'd been pronounced dead on arrival at our hospital. According to the emergency room staff, she'd been gone for approximately 2.5 hours by the time she reached us. Dr. Martinez and I began our preliminary examination and documentation. Sarah was positioned on our main examination table, and we had started filling out the required paperwork, both of us seated at desks that faced away from the table, giving us space to work without constantly staring at the deceased. The morgue was completely silent except for the soft scratching of our pens on paper and the low hum of the refrigeration units. We'd been working for maybe 20 minutes when we heard the unmistakable sound of metal creaking, the examination table straining under shifting weight. Dr. Martinez and I looked at each other for a split second before turning around. What we saw defied every medical principle I'd ever learned. Sarah was sitting upright on the table, not slumped over or partially raised. She was sitting completely upright, her back straight, her legs dangling over the edge of the table. Her eyes were open and fixed directly on us, but they weren't the eyes of someone alive. They were pale, glassy, with that unmistakable vacancy of death. Yet somehow they were tracking our movements. Before either of us could react or speak, Sarah opened her mouth and asked, in a voice that was barely above a whisper but perfectly clear, "Where is my purse?" The question hung in the air between us for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. Then, just as deliberately as she had sat up, Sarah lowered herself back down onto the table. Not falling or collapsing, she moved with purpose, control, as if she were simply lying down to rest. Dr. Martinez, who I'd always seen as unflappable, slowly removed her glasses and rubbed her face with both hands. I watched her lips move in what I assumed was a silent prayer. My own hands were shaking so badly I had to set down my pen. "Let's step outside for a moment," Dr. Martinez said quietly. In the hallway, under the harsh fluorescent lighting, she turned to me with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of professional concern and genuine bewilderment. "Listen," she said, "I know what we both just witnessed, and I know it's impossible from a medical standpoint. Sarah has been deceased for hours. There's no brain activity, no circulation, no respiratory function. What we just saw cannot happen." I nodded, though I wasn't sure I entirely agreed with her certainty. But she continued, "Sometimes there are attachments that don't let people go immediately. Material possessions, unfinished business, concerns about loved ones. These objects might have held significant meaning for her. It's possible, and I'm speaking purely from years of observation here, not from any medical textbook, that she's not ready to let go of something important." Dr. Martinez explained that in her 26 years working with the deceased, she'd occasionally witnessed phenomena that couldn't be easily explained. Bodies that seemed to respond to emotional stimuli, unexplained movements that appeared too purposeful to be mere post-mortem reflexes. When we returned to the morgue, I approached Sarah's body with a mixture of professional duty and genuine fear. Part of me expected her to sit up again, to ask once more about her belongings. But she remained still, peaceful, exactly as we would expect. I looked at her face more carefully this time. Even in death, there was something in her expression that spoke of sadness, of incompleteness. Her brow was slightly furrowed, not with pain but with worry, as if she died with something important left undone. Dr. Martinez had retrieved Sarah's personal effects from the emergency department, the items that had been collected from the accident scene. Among them was indeed a purse, a small black leather bag that had somehow survived the crash largely intact. We continued our work with extra care and attention. I found myself talking to Sarah as we proceeded, something I'd never done before with a deceased person. I told her that her belongings were safe, that we would make sure they were returned to her family, that she didn't need to worry about anything being lost or forgotten. The rest of our shift passed without incident. Sarah's body remained still, and we completed all necessary procedures. Her family claimed her 2 days later, and I made sure that every single one of her personal belongings was accounted for and returned to them. But what stays with me isn't the impossible moment when she sat up and spoke. It's what I saw in her eyes during those few seconds when she looked at us. Despite the physical vacancy of death, there was something else there. A spark of awareness, of concern, of unfinished business that transcended the physical limitations of her deceased body. The experience taught me that death might not be the immediate, complete cessation we often think it is. Maybe consciousness doesn't simply switch off like a light. Maybe sometimes, when people die suddenly, unexpectedly, there are loose ends that need tying up, concerns that need addressing, even if it's just the location of a purse. I've never witnessed anything like that again in the 3 years since Sarah's death. But I've changed the way I work with the deceased. I talk to them now, reassuring them that their belongings are safe, that their families will be notified, that they don't need to worry about the practical matters they left behind. Because sometimes, in those final moments or hours after death, maybe part of us is still listening, still caring about the small details that mattered so much in life. And maybe, just maybe, a simple reassurance about something as mundane as a missing purse can help a troubled soul finally find peace. My name is Miguel Santos, and I worked as an embalming assistant in Albuquerque, New Mexico, during the late 2000s. I was 24 years old when this happened, still learning the trade under the guidance of an experienced embalmer named Roberto Vega. Roberto had been in the funeral business for over 30 years and had trained dozens of apprentices over the decades. The mortuary where we worked was located in a converted warehouse in an older part of the city. Roberto had purchased the building in the 80s and slowly transformed it into a fully functional preparation facility. It served several smaller funeral homes in the area that didn't have their own embalming facilities. What made our situation unique was the building's history. Roberto had bought the property from a man whose uncle had lived there for many years before his death. The uncle, according to local rumors, had become involved in some very dark practices after his wife passed away. Neighbors reported seeing strange lights at all hours, hearing unusual sounds, and witnessing the man bringing dead animals onto the property for purposes no one wanted to speculate about. When the uncle died, the family had demolished the original house immediately, claiming they'd found disturbing artifacts and symbols throughout the structure. The lot sat empty for several years before Roberto purchased it and built his mortuary. Roberto had always been straightforward with his employees about the property's history. He believed in being honest about the unusual occurrences that sometimes happened there unexplained sounds. Tools that moved from where they'd been placed, occasional equipment malfunctions that couldn't be explained. The important thing, Roberto always told us, is to stay focused on our work and not let these things distract us from treating the deceased with respect. I'd been working there for about 6 months when we received the body of a middle-aged construction worker named Frank Morrison. He died of a heart attack while working on a job site downtown. Frank was a big man, probably 6 feet 2 inches tall and weighing around 240 pounds. He had a full beard and weathered hands that spoke of decades of manual labor. It was a Thursday afternoon, and Roberto had left me alone to begin the preliminary work while he ran errands for our other cases. This wasn't unusual. I'd progressed enough in my training that I could handle the initial stages of the embalming process without direct supervision. I was working on preparing the arterial solution when I needed to retrieve a hose from the storage area on the opposite side of the room. As I walked across the preparation room, I was facing away from Frank's body, which was positioned on the main table in the center of the space. Just as I reached for the hose, I heard something that made my blood run cold, a low, rumbling laugh. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakably laughter. The kind of chuckle someone might make when they're trying to suppress their amusement, except it was deeper, more resonant than any laugh I'd ever heard from a living person. I froze, my hand still reaching for the hose. The laugh had definitely come from behind me, from the direction of the preparation table. But that was impossible. I was alone in the building, and Frank Morrison had been dead for over 6 hours. Slowly, I turned around to look at the table. Frank's body appeared exactly as I had left it, lying flat, arms at his sides, eyes closed. But something was different about his face. Frank Morrison was smiling. Not the peaceful, slight upturn of lips that sometimes occurs naturally after death. This was a wide, unmistakable grin that stretched across his entire face. It was the kind of smile someone makes when they've just heard the funniest joke of their life, except it was on the face of a dead man. I stood there staring at him for what felt like several minutes, but was probably only 30 seconds. The smile remained fixed on his face, and those closed eyes somehow seemed to be twinkling with amusement, even though I knew that was medically impossible. My first instinct was to run, but I also knew I couldn't leave Frank's body unattended. Roberto trusted me to maintain our professional standards, and abandoning my post wasn't an option, no matter how terrified I felt. Instead, I backed toward the entrance of the preparation room, keeping my eyes on Frank's body the entire time. I waited there by the door, watching for any other changes, any additional movement that might help me understand what I'd witnessed. The smile remained for several more minutes, before gradually fading back to the neutral expression Frank's face had held when Roberto and I first positioned him on the table. When Roberto returned about an hour later, I immediately told him what had happened. I expected him to dismiss it as my imagination or suggest I'd misinterpreted some normal post-mortem phenomenon. Instead, Roberto listened carefully to my account, then walked over to examine Frank's body more closely. "Miguel," he said after completing his inspection, "I need to tell you something about this building. When I bought this property, the previous owner warned me about the history of this land. His uncle didn't just dabble in dark practices. He was obsessed with the idea of communicating with the dead, of bringing back those who had passed on. Roberto explained that according to the uncle's surviving relatives, the old man had claimed he'd made contact with something he called the one below, some kind of entity that he believed could manipulate the recently deceased. The uncle used to tell people that this entity could use dead bodies like puppets, Roberto continued. That it could make them move, speak, even express emotions they'd never had in life. His family thought he was losing his mind, but after he died and they cleaned out his house, they found journals describing rituals, symbols, methods for what he called inviting the presence in. I felt sick to my stomach as Roberto spoke. The idea that something malevolent might be using Frank's body for its own purposes was more terrifying than any ghost story I'd ever heard. "So what do we do?" I asked. Roberto was quiet for a long moment. "We finish our work with Mr. Morrison and get him to his family as quickly as possible. We don't engage with anything unusual that might happen. We don't respond if he moves or makes sounds. And we make sure we're never alone with him again until he leaves this building." Over the next 2 days, while we completed the embalming process and prepared Frank for his funeral, several other strange incidents occurred. We heard that same low laughter on multiple occasions. Twice, we returned to the preparation room to find Frank's body in a slightly different position than we'd left it. Once, I could have sworn I saw his lips moving slightly, as if he was whispering something too quiet for us to hear. But we followed Roberto's instructions. We ignored these phenomena, completed our professional responsibilities, and maintained our focus on treating Frank's body with dignity and respect. When Frank's family came to collect him, they mentioned how peaceful he looked, how the expression on his face seemed almost cheerful. They were comforted by this, interpreting it as a sign that he died without pain or fear. Roberto and I never told them about the laughter, the unexplained movements, or the unsettling smile. Some things are better left unsaid. After Frank's funeral, the unusual activity in our building decreased significantly, but never completely stopped. Roberto continued working there for several more years before retiring and selling the property. The new owners converted it into an auto repair shop, and as far as I know, they've never reported any supernatural incidents. But I've never forgotten the sound of that deep, impossible laughter, or the sight of that wide grin on a dead man's face. It taught me that death might not be the end of our connection to this world, and that sometimes other forces might find ways to use what we leave behind. I'm writing this account because I need to get it out of my head, even though I know most people won't believe what I'm about to tell you. My name is Marcus Williams, and I worked briefly as a morgue assistant at Sacred Heart Hospital in El Paso, Texas, during the summer of 2009. I was 25 years old then, trying to save money for medical school by working wherever I could find employment. The job at Sacred Heart was supposed to be temporary, just a few months to build up my savings before starting my pre-med program in the fall. The hospital served some of the rougher neighborhoods in El Paso, areas where violence was unfortunately common, and where the authorities sometimes had to make difficult decisions about how thoroughly to investigate certain deaths. It was a harsh reality that I was still learning to accept. On a sweltering Tuesday afternoon in July, we received the body of a 6-year-old boy named Antonio Morales. According to the paperwork, he'd been found in an abandoned house on the outskirts of the city. The circumstances of his death were disturbing. I won't go into the specific details out of respect for his memory, but I will say that the injuries he'd sustained were clearly intentional and bore an unmistakable resemblance to crucifixion. Dr. Patricia Kowalski and I were scheduled to begin the preliminary examination that afternoon. But before we could start our work, our supervisor, Mr. James Henderson, burst into the morgue looking more agitated than I'd ever seen him. He spoke privately with Dr. Kowalski for several minutes in hushed, urgent tones. Through the glass partition, I could see both of them gesturing emphatically, and Mr. Henderson kept glancing toward the examination table, where Antonio's small body lay covered with a white sheet. When their conversation ended, Mr. Henderson left quickly, practically jogging toward the elevator. Dr. Kowalski returned to the preparation area and immediately began gathering up our paperwork and equipment. "Marcus," she said without looking at me, "there's been a change of plans. The family is coming to collect the body immediately." This was highly unusual. Typically, families had to wait for the completion of various administrative and medical procedures before they could claim their deceased relatives. In cases involving suspicious deaths like Antonio's, the wait was often much longer. "Should I prepare him for viewing?" I asked. Dr. Kowalski shook her head. "No preparation necessary. They specifically requested that we not perform any procedures. They're bringing their own arrangements." Something in her tone made me uneasy. I'd worked with Dr. Kowalski for 3 months, and she was usually very straightforward about our procedures. The fact that she seemed nervous and was avoiding eye contact told me that something was seriously wrong. About 15 minutes later, we heard voices in the corridor outside the morgue. Dr. Kowalski instructed me to help transfer Antonio's body to a gurney so we could meet the family at the loading dock behind the hospital. When we wheeled the gurney through the rear entrance, I saw a large black van parked in the loading area. 2 people stood beside it, a woman who appeared to be in her 40s and a man of similar age. Both were dressed entirely in black, and their expressions were grim and hostile. What immediately caught my attention, however, was what was visible in the back of their van. Instead of a simple wooden casket or a body bag, there was an elaborate coffin that looked like nothing I'd ever seen before. The coffin was painted deep red, not the mahogany or cherry finish you might see at a funeral home, but a bright, almost blood-red color that seemed to gleam under the afternoon sun. Wrapped around the entire casket was a length of barbed wire, twisted and coiled like a crown of thorns. The wire wasn't rusty or old. It looked new, sharp, deliberately placed. In the center of the coffin's lid was a symbol that I couldn't identify, but that filled me with an immediate sense of dread. It appeared to be carved or burned into the wood. A complex design that hurt to look at directly, as if my eyes wanted to focus anywhere else. The man beside the van was handling the barbed wire without any protection, unwrapping sections of it to open the coffin. I watched as the sharp points cut into his hands, drawing blood, but he showed no reaction to the pain. Blood dripped from his fingers onto the asphalt as he worked. The woman approached us as we positioned the gurney near their vehicle. She didn't speak to us directly, but I heard her muttering under her breath in what sounded like Spanish mixed with words I didn't recognize. Her eyes were red from crying, But there was something else in her expression, a kind of fury that made my skin crawl. Dr. Kowalski and I transferred Antonio's body into the red coffin as quickly as possible. The interior was lined with black fabric that felt strangely warm to the touch, and there were more symbols carved into the wood inside. As soon as we placed Antonio in the coffin, the woman began speaking more loudly, directing her words toward the child's body. I couldn't understand most of what she was saying, but I caught fragments that sounded like prayers or chants. The man joined in, and their voices created a low, rhythmic murmur that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath our feet. When they finished their ritual, they closed the coffin and began rewrapping it with the barbed wire. The sound of metal scraping against wood was like fingernails on a chalkboard magnified tenfold. Before they left, the woman approached Dr. Kowalski and handed her an envelope. She spoke in heavily accented English. "For your silence, for your cooperation. You saw nothing unusual here today." After they drove away, Dr. Kowalski and I stood in the loading dock for several minutes without speaking. Finally, she opened the envelope. Inside was more cash than either of us made in a month. Back in the morgue, Dr. Kowalski pulled me aside for a conversation I'll never forget. "Marcus," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "what we just witnessed. This isn't the first time I've encountered something like this. That family, they weren't just grieving parents. They were practitioners of something very old and very dark." She explained that based on the symbols I'd described and the elaborate nature of the coffin, she believed Antonio's death hadn't been random violence. It had been ritualistic, sacrificial. The red coffin, the barbed wire, the symbols, these were all elements of what she called an offering to darker forces. The way that child died, the specific injuries he sustained, Dr. Kowalski continued, combined with what we just saw, suggests that his death was part of some kind of ritual. And the family's behavior indicates they were either complicit in what happened or were trying to complete some kind of spiritual transaction. The implications of her words made me physically ill. The idea that someone could deliberately harm a child for supernatural purposes was beyond anything I'd ever imagined encountering in my work. Dr. Kowalski stressed that we needed to forget what we'd seen, that reporting it would likely put us in danger. She'd heard stories from other medical professionals about people who'd tried to expose similar incidents and had faced serious consequences, threats, intimidation, even physical harm. "The authorities already know about this case," she said. The fact that the family was allowed to claim the body so quickly, with no questions asked, tells me that some kind of arrangement has already been made. People with this kind of power, who practice these kinds of rituals, they have connections we can't fight. Over the next week, I couldn't stop thinking about Antonio and that horrifying red coffin. I kept imagining that little boy trapped inside that dark, symbol-covered box, surrounded by barbed wire like some kind of perverted crown of thorns. I tried researching the symbols I'd seen, but every internet search led me to websites and forums that made me feel like I was looking into an abyss I didn't want to understand. There were references to ancient practices, to sacrificial rituals, to beliefs about offering innocent souls to entities that existed in the spaces between life and death. 3 weeks after the incident, Mr. Henderson called Dr. Kowalski and me into his office. He thanked us for our discretion and professionalism regarding the Antonio Morales case. He also informed us that there was no record of the case in our official files, no documentation that the child had ever been brought to our facility. Sometimes, he said, the best way to serve the community is to allow certain families to handle their grief in their own traditional ways. Not everything needs to be documented or questioned. That conversation was the final straw for me. I submitted my resignation the following day and left Sacred Heart Hospital 2 weeks earlier than I had originally planned. I used the money from that envelope, which Dr. Kowalski had insisted we split, to pay for my first semester of medical school. But I never forgot about Antonio Morales or that blood-red coffin wrapped in barbed wire. Sometimes, late at night when I'm studying or working, I find myself wondering what happened to that little boy after his family drove away. Was he given a proper burial, or was his body used for additional rituals? Were there other children like him, other families involved in these dark practices? The worst part is knowing that there are people in positions of authority who are aware of these activities and choose to look the other way. Money, fear, or complicity, whatever their reasons, the system that should protect innocent children failed Antonio completely. I never reported what I witnessed, and I've carried that guilt with me for over 15 years now. Dr. Kowalski was probably right that speaking out would have been dangerous and ultimately futile. But that doesn't make the silence any easier to live with. I became a pediatrician, partly because of what happened to Antonio. I wanted to dedicate my career to protecting children, to being someone who would never look away when a child was in danger. It's my way of honoring his memory and trying to balance the scales for my own cowardice that summer. But I'll never forget the sound of that barbed wire scraping against the red coffin, or the sight of that man's blood dripping onto the asphalt, while he prepared what I can only assume was Antonio's final resting place. Some images burn themselves into your memory so deeply that no amount of time or distance can erase them. And sometimes, when I'm examining a young patient who reminds me of Antonio, dark hair, serious eyes, about 6 years old, I have to step out of the room for a moment to collect myself, because I know that somewhere out there are still people who view children not as precious lives to be protected, but as commodities to be used in their twisted spiritual transactions. That knowledge will haunt me for the rest of my life. I had an experience that still haunts me to this day. One of those moments when reality bends in ways that make you question everything you thought you knew about the world. This happened back in 2008 when I was completing my medical residency at a private hospital in upstate New York. My mother, who had been a nurse for over 20 years, managed to get me a placement in the pathology department through a colleague of hers, a woman named Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who ran the hospital morgue. Dr. Mitchell was in her mid-50s then, a no-nonsense professional who demanded absolute precision in everything we did. But underneath that stern exterior was one of the kindest people I'd ever met. I was assigned to work the night shift with her for 3 months, just the two of us alone in the basement level of the hospital. Despite the eerie atmosphere of working with the deceased in the dead of night, I never felt truly frightened. The cases were certainly disturbing at times, but nothing ever seemed unnatural. Dr. Mitchell's presence was reassuring, and I respected her too much to bring up the questions that gnawed at me about whether we ever experienced anything unexplained. That changed one October night when everything I thought I understood about that place was shattered. Dr. Mitchell had stepped out around 11 p.m. to handle some paperwork with the administration office. She trusted me completely by then. We'd been working together for 2 months, and she often left me alone for short periods. The morgue was quiet that night. We had finished all our work, so I decided to grab a coffee from the vending machine down the hall. When I returned about 20 minutes later, I approached the morgue through our usual routine. There was a small observation room just before the main doors, with a window that looked into the preparation area where we kept our equipment. I always made it a habit to glance through that window before entering, just a quick check to make sure everything was as we'd left it. What I saw through that window made my blood freeze. There was a clipboard, one of those heavy metal ones we used for paperwork, floating about 3 feet above the preparation table. It wasn't swaying or bobbing like something suspended by a string. It was perfectly still, hovering in midair as if gravity had simply forgotten about it. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, unable to move, unable to breathe, telling myself that exhaustion was playing tricks on my eyes. But the clipboard remained there, defying every law of physics I'd ever learned. Finally, my training kicked in. I pushed through the door with shaking hands, and the moment I entered the room, the clipboard dropped to the floor with a metallic clang that echoed through the empty space. The sound was so loud, so real, that I knew this wasn't my imagination. I didn't pick it up. I couldn't. Instead, I backed out of the room and practically ran to the cafeteria, where I sat nursing a cup of terrible coffee, trying to convince myself that what I'd seen was impossible. But the clipboard was still on the floor when I finally worked up the courage to return physical proof that something had happened. I placed it back on the table, my hands trembling, and that's when I heard it. From the back of the morgue, where we kept the bodies on steel gurneys, came the sound of bare feet walking slowly across the tile floor. Then the unmistakable creak and groan of one of our gurneys, the specific sound they made when weight was placed on them, or when someone was moving around on the surface. Dr. Mitchell had left all the lights off in that section, and I knew she never worked in the dark. More importantly, I knew she was still upstairs, and there was absolutely no way anyone else could be down there. But someone or something was walking around back there. And from the sound of it, they were climbing onto one of the gurneys where we had a body covered by a sheet. I bolted from the room and took the elevator to the first floor, where I sat shaking in the waiting area until Dr. Mitchell returned about 10 minutes later. The moment she saw me, she knew something was wrong. My face must have been white as a sheet. I told her everything: the floating clipboard, the footsteps, the sounds from the gurney. I expected her to laugh, to suggest I'd been working too hard, to offer some rational explanation that would make everything make sense again. Instead, she sat down beside me in those uncomfortable plastic chairs and lowered her voice to barely above a whisper. "This isn't something I like to discuss," she said, glancing around to make sure we were alone. "But these things do happen. I believe in God and the light, and I know that darkness exists too. I'm not saying what you experienced was evil, not necessarily. But sometimes the people we care for down there don't realize they've passed on, or they're not ready to let go." She paused, and I could see her wrestling with whether to continue. "The woman we have on Gurney 3, the one who came in this afternoon, I think she's confused about her situation. Earlier today, before you arrived, I saw her sitting up on the gurney. She looked around the room slowly, as if she was searching for something or someone. Our eyes met for just a moment, and then she lay back down as if nothing had happened. It scared me, I'll admit, but this is our job. We're often the last people to care for them before their families take them home." Her words didn't comfort me, but I understood what she was saying. This was the reality of working with the dead. Sometimes the boundaries between life and death weren't as clear-cut as we'd like to believe. Dr. Mitchell asked me to come back downstairs with her. I didn't want to, but she was right. This was our job, and we couldn't abandon our responsibilities because of fear. When we reached the morgue entrance, Dr. Mitchell looked through the observation window first. Her face went pale. "The clipboard," she whispered. "It's floating again." I looked over her shoulder and saw it, the same impossible sight I'd witnessed earlier. The clipboard hung in the air, motionless and silent, as if suspended by invisible hands. Dr. Mitchell opened the door, and again the clipboard crashed to the floor. This time I forced myself to walk over and pick it up, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip it. Behind me, I heard Dr. Mitchell moving toward the back of the morgue where we kept the bodies. I listened as she flipped on the lights, and then her voice, speaking softly to someone I couldn't see. "That's enough now, honey," she said gently. "You need to rest. Your family will be here tomorrow to take you home." I heard the gurney creak again, and then the sound of wheels rolling as Dr. Mitchell moved the body to one of our refrigerated units. The metallic clang of the door closing echoed through the room with a finality that seemed to settle everything back into place. We worked in relative silence for the rest of the night, and the woman's family did indeed come to collect her the next morning. In the remaining month of my rotation, nothing like that ever happened again, though I never forgot that night. They say that sometimes what we can't see is more terrifying than what we can. But I learned that night that there are things in this world that exist in the spaces between what we understand and what we fear, things that remind us that death might not be as final as we'd like to believe. The memory of that floating clipboard and those footsteps in the dark has stayed with me for over 15 years now. Sometimes I wonder if Dr. Mitchell was right, if the woman simply needed someone to acknowledge her presence one last time before she could let go. Or maybe she was trying to tell us something we weren't ready to hear. Either way, that night changed how I think about the thin line between life and death, and the responsibilities we have to those who cross over to the other side. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.